In 1887, in a small Kansas town, a mother was forced to stand on the auction floor, not goods, not objects, but a human being, along with her 3 young daughters. The crowd roared, the wood fell, and no one in that town moved until a stranger stood up and did something the whole land had never seen before. This is the story of Evelyn Carter, the woman outcast, and the man who chose her side when no one else would. If you're watching this video, please like and comment the name of the city you're watching so I know how far this story has come. And don't go anywhere, because what happens next will be something you won't be able to see. The hammer came down at 10:30 on a Tuesday morning, and the sound of it carried all the way to the edge of town where the old mill stood rotting in the August heat. Evelyn Carter heard it from behind the locked door of the jailhouse storage room where they'd put her and the girls to wait. She didn't know it was a hammer at first. She thought it was a gunshot, and her hands went straight to Maggie's shoulders, pulling her oldest daughter close before her brain had time to catch up with her body. "Mama," Maggie said, her voice flat and careful the way it had been for weeks now. "It's just the auction starting." Evelyn released her, said nothing. Grace was asleep in the corner on a folded horse blanket, her small chest rising and falling with the particular innocence of a 7-year-old who had already learned to sleep through things she didn't want to think about. Lily sat beside her with her knees pulled up to her chin, not speaking, not looking at anything in particular. She'd stopped doing that, looking at things, sometime in the past month. Evelyn wasn't sure exactly when. Outside, through the single high window with its rusted iron bar, she could hear the noise of the crowd. Red Creek on auction day drew people from 3 counties: farmers, ranchers, merchants, a few lawyers down from Dodge. It was a social occasion. There were women in good dresses and men in clean shirts and children chasing each other between the wagons, while their parents bid on plows and breeding stock and whatever else the county had seized for unpaid debt. This year, the county had seized the Carter family. Evelyn had turned 31 in June. She didn't look it. She looked older, not in a way that made her seem worn out, exactly, but in the way that a woman looks when she has been doing the work of 2 people for a very long time and has gotten accustomed to it. Her hair was dark brown and she kept it pinned, though a few strands always found their way loose by midday. Her hands were rough. Her eyes were gray-green and direct in a way that made people uncomfortable, which had always been a problem for her and which she had never figured out how to fix. Her husband Thomas had died in March. Pneumonia, moving fast through a body that was already weakened from the winter. He was 33 years old, and he had coughed himself to death in the bedroom of their farmhouse, while Evelyn changed his compresses every 2 hours, and Maggie kept the girls quiet in the kitchen, and all of them pretended they didn't know what was coming. What came after Thomas was worse than Evelyn had expected, and she had expected quite a lot. The farm had debts. She had known about some of them. Thomas had been a proud man in that particular frontier way that meant he didn't discuss money with his wife. And so she had known the shape of their finances without knowing the specifics. And the specifics turned out to be considerably more dire than the shape had suggested. There was a mortgage on the land, 2 seasons of seed purchased on credit, an equipment loan from a merchant in Dodge who had sent a representative with a very professional manner and very little patience exactly 11 days after the funeral. Evelyn had tried. She was not a woman who gave up easily, and she had tried everything she could think of with the tools she had available to her, which were not many. She'd written to her parents in Ohio. They were dead. She'd written to Thomas's brother in Colorado. He wrote back that he was sorry for her trouble and that he had his own family to think about. She'd tried to negotiate with the bank and the merchant and the county clerk, and each of those conversations had the same quality: polite on the surface and immovable underneath, like a wall covered in wallpaper. By May, she had understood that the farm was going. What she had not understood was Hector Blaine. Hector Blaine was Thomas's mother's cousin, which made him some kind of relation by marriage that Evelyn had never worked out precisely and had never needed to work out until this spring. He was 53, heavy-set, with small dark eyes and a neat mustache that he kept well-trimmed as if to make up for the general untidiness of everything else about him. He'd come to the funeral, appeared out of nowhere, really, sat in the back pew, and afterward pressed Evelyn's hand with great sincerity and said he was there if she needed anything. She thought he was just being polite. He came back in April, then again in May. Each visit he was helpful and concerned, and increasingly interested in the specific details of what Evelyn owned, what the debts totaled, what options she had. He had a lawyer in Wichita, he said. He had connections at the county courthouse. He knew people who could help. What Hector Blaine actually had, Evelyn came to understand too late, was a mechanism. Kansas law in 1887 was particular about debt and dependency, and the particular way it was particular suited a man like Hector Blaine very well. Under certain conditions, a widow without means, minor children, debts in excess of property value, a family could be placed under guardianship. The guardian managed their assets, their labor, their contracts. The guardian made decisions on their behalf. The guardian was compensated. Evelyn had signed papers she didn't fully understand in a lawyer's office in June, while Grace sat on her lap and played with the buttons on her sleeve. By the time she understood what she had signed, it was too late to unsign it. Hector Blaine had become their legal guardian. What happened next came quickly. He moved them out of the farmhouse into a boarding house in Red Creek. 2 rooms, 1 window. He sold the remaining farm equipment and the milk cow and the chickens and deposited the proceeds into an account that bore his name. He told Evelyn that he was managing their affairs until she was on solid footing. He told her that arrangements were being made. He told her many things that turned out to mean nothing. In late July, he told her about the labor contracts. "It's a practical solution," he said. He was sitting across the table from her in the boarding house dining room, his hat on the table, his hands folded. Families in hardship situations, they go to families of means. The women work. The children work as their age allows. It's done all the time. The family receives room and board, the employer receives labor, and I receive a placement fee. Everyone benefits. "We're not property," Evelyn said. Hector Blaine smiled. "Of course not. It's a labor contract. Entirely legal. I want to see a lawyer. You signed papers authorizing me to make these decisions on your behalf." He picked up his hat. "The auction is August 14th. You and the girls will be available for placement. Try to have them look presentable." He was at the door before she found her voice again. "And if I refuse?" He turned around. The smile was still there, but had changed in some way she couldn't quite name. "The state has facilities for children whose guardians are unable to provide for them. I'd hate for your daughters to have that experience." He left. Evelyn sat at the table for a long time after, very still, while the particular quality of her helplessness arranged itself around her like a room she hadn't chosen and couldn't leave. That was 3 weeks ago. Now it was August 14th. The storage room smelled like leather and dust and something animal underneath. Grace had woken up and was sitting close to Lily without speaking. Maggie stood near Evelyn, watching the door. Outside, the crowd noise had a rhythm to it, voices rising and falling, laughter occasionally, the auctioneer's voice carrying like a carnival barker. "Mama," Maggie's voice was careful. "What's going to happen to us?" Evelyn looked at her daughter. 9 years old with Thomas's straight brown hair and her own gray-green eyes. Already too serious. Already carrying things no child should carry. "I don't know," Evelyn said. It was the truest answer she had. Maggie nodded, accepting this. "Are we going to be separated?" "I will do everything I can to prevent that." "That's not the same as no." "No," Evelyn said. "It's not the same as no." The door opened. A deputy Evelyn didn't know stood in the frame, a young man with sunburned ears and the expression of someone doing a job he didn't entirely want to be doing. "Time," he said. "Blaine says get the girls ready." Evelyn turned to her daughters. Lily had her hands pressed flat against her thighs. Grace reached over and took Lily's hand without being asked. "Stay together," Evelyn said. "Whatever happens, stay together. Hold on to each other and do not let go." They walked out into the sun. The auction block in Red Creek was a raised wooden platform in the center of the main street, built originally for livestock sales and still serving that purpose on most days. Today it had been swept and a length of bunting strung across the front in the county colors. The auctioneer, a man named Pell, stood to one side with his ledger. Hector Blaine stood on the other side looking satisfied. The crowd was larger than Evelyn had expected. She counted faces without meaning to, a habit she'd developed, always scanning rooms, always measuring, and found them mostly curious rather than hostile, which was almost worse. Curiosity meant they saw a spectacle. Hostility at least implied they understood that what they were watching was wrong. A few of them did look uncomfortable. She caught two women near the dry goods store leaning close to each other, one of them shaking her head. A farmer in the back row had his arms crossed and his mouth tight, but none of them spoke. None of them moved. Carter family, Pell announced. He had a big voice and used all of it. Widow woman, 31, sound health, experienced in farm work and domestic labor. 3 girl children ages 9, 8, and 7. Labor contracts available for individual placement or as a group. We'll hear bids on the group first. Someone in the crowd made a joke Evelyn couldn't quite catch. There was laughter. Grace pressed closer to Evelyn's side. Lily was standing very straight, chin up, the way she did when she was frightened and trying not to show it. Maggie had gone absolutely still. Evelyn put her arm around Grace's shoulders and felt her daughter's small body trembling. The bidding started at $20 for the group contract. A man near the front, a farmer, from the look of his hands, called it out. Then another bid, $25. Someone in the back, $30. It moved quickly, which was worse than if it had moved slowly, because speed implied eagerness, implied that these men saw value, implied that they had already thought about what they would do with a woman and 3 children who were legally required to obey. $40. Then $45. Evelyn stopped hearing the individual numbers. She was watching her daughters instead, watching Lily's chin tremble, watching Grace's eyes fill, watching Maggie stand perfectly still with her fists at her sides and her expression gone to stone. And it was Maggie's expression that undid her, because she knew that look. She'd worn it herself. It was the look of someone who has understood that their options are limited and who is preparing to endure. Maggie was 9 years old and she was preparing to endure. And Evelyn could not stop it. She had tried every legal avenue she could think of, and none of them had opened. And she was standing on a platform in the August heat being sold to the highest bidder, and she could not stop a single thing that was happening to her daughters. She was reaching for Maggie's hand when the voice came from the back of the crowd. "I'll buy all 4 of them." The crowd shifted. People turned. The voice had come from a man standing at the far edge of the gathering, near the hitching post where the horses stood tied, and even from the platform Evelyn could see that he was a large man, broad through the shoulders, wearing a canvas coat despite the heat, with a dark hat and the kind of stillness that comes from spending most of your time outdoors in places where stillness is necessary. She didn't know him. She was almost certain she'd never seen him. "State your price, sir," Pell called out. "What's left on the contract total?" The man's voice was even. Not loud exactly, but carrying. The kind of voice you heard clearly without knowing why. Pell consulted his ledger. Total contract value, labor, and placement, $140. "I'll give you $150, the man said. "All 4 together, right now. No more bidding." The crowd stirred. Hector Blaine's expression shifted, the satisfaction replaced by something calculating. $150 was more than he'd expected to get. Evelyn could tell that much. She watched him weigh it, the money on one side, the pleasure of drawn-out process on the other. Money won. It usually did with Hector Blaine. "Sold," Pell said. The hammer came down. The man in the canvas coat walked forward through the crowd, which parted for him in a way that crowds will sometimes part for a person who moves as though parting is the only sensible option. He pulled out his wallet, counted bills to Pell, signed the ledger with a pen the auctioneer offered. Then he looked up at the platform. His face was weathered, somewhere in his mid-40s, with dark eyes and a jaw that needed shaving. He was not a handsome man in any conventional sense. He was a man who looked like he had been through difficult things and had not been refined by them so much as worn down to what was essential. He looked at Evelyn for a moment without speaking. "I'm Caleb Mercer," he said. "I've got a ranch 14 miles west. I need a cook and hands." "We're not charity cases," Evelyn said. Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. Something moved across his face. "I didn't say you were." He looked at the girls. "Any of them sick?" "No." "Good." He nodded once, as if confirming something to himself. "My wagon's at the end of the street. I'll get it loaded and be back in 20 minutes. Be ready." He walked away. Evelyn stood on the platform with her daughters and watched him go. The crowd was already dispersing. The entertainment concluded. Hector Blaine was pocketing his money without looking in her direction. "Mama," Grace said quietly, Is he a good man? Evelyn didn't have an answer to that. She'd thought Thomas was a good man, and Thomas had been mostly, but Thomas had also hidden the extent of their debts from her for 3 years because he was ashamed, and that shame had left her standing on an auction block in August with 3 daughters who were now under the legal authority of a stranger. I don't know, she said. Grace considered this. He has a nice voice, she said. Grace, I'm just saying. The wagon was a freight wagon, practical, with a good team of sorrel horses that were well fed and well kept. That told Evelyn something, though she wasn't sure what. A man who kept his animals well might keep other things well. Or he might care about his animals and nothing else. She'd met both kinds. Caleb Mercer loaded their single trunk without being asked, secured it with a rope he tied correctly. He helped Grace up to the seat when she couldn't quite reach, one hand, quick, and then stepped back without making a thing of it. Evelyn climbed up herself. She wasn't going to ask him for help, and she didn't need to. They left Red Creek in silence. The town fell away behind them. The dry goods store, the church steeple, the boarding house where they'd spent 6 weeks of Hector Blaine's guardianship. And then they were on the open road west, with the prairie flat and enormous around them, and the sky enormous above that. Lily was sitting in the wagon bed with Grace, who had fallen asleep again with her head on Lily's shoulder. Maggie was on the seat between Evelyn and Caleb, sitting straight, watching the road. After about a mile, Maggie said, "Why did you do it?" Evelyn put her hand on Maggie's knee. "Maggie." "It's all right," Caleb said. He was quiet for a moment, eyes on the road. "I watched that whole thing from across the street. Didn't plan to do anything. Told myself it wasn't my business." "But you did anyway," Maggie said. "Yeah." He didn't elaborate. "What made you change your mind?" Another pause. Long enough that Evelyn thought he wasn't going to answer. "Your sister," he said finally. "The little one." She was shaking, and she grabbed her other sister's hand. He shifted the reins slightly. "My daughter used to do that." The prairie went by. A hawk turned slow circles above a stand of grass and then dropped and was gone. "What happened to your daughter?" Maggie asked. "Maggie," Evelyn said more firmly. "She died," Caleb said. 3 years ago. Her and her mother both. Fever." No one said anything after that for a while. Twin Pines Ranch was not what Evelyn had expected, which meant she wasn't sure what she'd expected. Something rougher, maybe. A bachelor's operation, the kind that accumulates dirt and disorder when there's no one to push back against either. What she found was a ranch that had clearly been well maintained and was now showing the particular kind of neglect that comes from a single person trying to keep up with work that was built for 2. The house was a solid 2-story frame structure, the paint fading but the boards sound. The barn was in good repair. There were fences that needed mending in spots, and a kitchen garden that had been half-heartedly tended, and a porch where 2 rocking chairs sat side by side, with the visible awkwardness of objects that have not been moved in a long time. Evelyn noticed the 2 chairs. She didn't say anything. Caleb showed them the house without ceremony. There were 4 rooms upstairs. He'd been sleeping in the downstairs room off the kitchen since, he said, and left the sentence there. The girls could have 2 of the upstairs rooms. Evelyn, the 3rd. The 4th had boxes in it that he'd get around to eventually. "You cook?" he asked. "Yes." "Good. I don't." He said it without embarrassment, just a statement of fact. "Kitchen's yours, house management's yours, outside work, I'll tell you what's needed." He looked at the girls. "The older ones, if they're willing, there's work I can use help with. Nothing that'll hurt them. The little one can have lighter tasks until she's older." "Grace," Evelyn said. "Her name is Grace, that one is Lily, and this is Maggie." He looked at each of them in turn and nodded once, committing it. "Caleb," he said to Maggie, since she was the one who'd spoken to him. "I know," Maggie said. "You said." Something that might have been amusement moved across his face. "I did." He looked at Evelyn. "Supper's your department. There's salt pork and beans in the cellar and flour in the pantry and eggs in the coop. I'll be in the barn." He went to the barn. Evelyn stood in the kitchen of a stranger's house with her 3 daughters and looked at the stove and the pantry and the back door that opened onto a yard where chickens moved in the afternoon light. "Mama," Lily said. She was standing at the window, looking out. Her voice had something in it that Evelyn hadn't heard in weeks. "There's a piano." Evelyn went to the window. In the small room off the parlor, just visible through the doorway, was an upright piano, dark wood, with its key cover open. "Don't touch it," Evelyn said. "I know." But Lily kept looking at it. The first week was nothing but work, which was fine. Work was something Evelyn understood. She cleaned the kitchen properly, not just swept but scrubbed, the way her mother had taught her, every surface and corner. She found the cellar and took inventory. She set up a laundry system. She established a routine for the girls that gave them tasks, and therefore purpose, because children who had nothing to do had too much time to feel things that were better channeled elsewhere. Maggie took to the ranch accounts immediately. Caleb had a ledger that was maintained with the grudging minimum effort of a man who knew numbers were necessary and wanted to spend as little time on them as possible. On the third day, Maggie found it on the kitchen table where he'd left it and was going through it with a pencil before Evelyn caught her. "You cannot go through a man's accounts," Evelyn said. "He's not keeping them right," Maggie said. He's been underbilling for the hay sales. That's why the feed line is always short." She pointed to a column. "See? He gets 3 cents per bale, and he should be getting $4.50 at current market. He's been doing it for 2 years. Evelyn looked at the column. She wasn't terrible with numbers herself, and she could follow what Maggie was showing her, and Maggie was right. "Put it back," she said. "But Mama—" "Put it back, and don't touch it again without permission." That evening, after supper, Maggie appeared in the barn doorway while Caleb was doing the evening feed. Evelyn watched from the kitchen window, not close enough to hear, and saw Maggie explain something while Caleb listened without expression. He took the ledger she was holding out, looked at the page she indicated, looked at it again. Then he looked at Maggie. He said something. Maggie said something back. He nodded. When Maggie came in to help with dishes, she was carrying herself slightly differently. Taller, maybe, or just less compressed. "He's going to let me go over the rest of the books," she said. "Is he?" "He said if I find more, he'll pay me in arithmetic lessons." Evelyn turned this over. "What do you need arithmetic lessons for? You're better at numbers than half the men in the county." Maggie looked at her with the flat patience of a 9-year-old who has already considered this. "I'm better than half the men in the county now. I want to be better than all of them when I'm grown." Evelyn didn't have an answer to that either. The trouble started showing up in Evelyn's chest around the end of the second week. Not trouble in any concrete form. Nothing had happened, nothing was wrong by any measurable standard, but a tightness that she couldn't quite exhale. A watchfulness. She had spent the past several months in survival mode. Assess the threat, respond to the threat, move to the next threat. Hector Blaine had been a threat. The auction had been a threat. The uncertainty of what came after the auction had been a threat. Now the threats were temporarily absent, and she did not know what to do with temporary absence. Caleb Mercer was not what she had been afraid of. She was having to revise her fears constantly, which was exhausting in its own way. He was gruff, but not cruel. He was direct to the point of bluntness, but the bluntness was at least honest. You always knew where you stood with him, which was more than could be said for most people she'd known. He ate what she cooked without complaint. He gave directions clearly and didn't double back to check that they'd been followed. He stayed out of her way in the house, and she stayed out of his way in the barn. And they had developed a household grammar of noises and silences that communicated without requiring much actual speech. He was not Thomas. She was not sure whether that was a relief or a grief or both. On the evening of the 17th day, she was alone on the porch after the girls were in bed when he came back from a long day of fencing and sat in the other rocking chair without being invited. She supposed it was his porch. She couldn't very well object. He smelled like work and horses, and the particular kind of outside smell that sticks to a man who has been out in it all day. He pulled out a pipe and then seemed to think better of it and put it back. "You don't have to stop on my account," she said. "My wife hated the smell," he said. And then, as if realizing what he'd said and where it led, he stopped. Evelyn looked out at the dark. The stars were spectacular out here, away from town, brilliant and dense in a way that had startled her the first night, and now just looked like the sky was supposed to look. "She would have liked your daughters," he said eventually. "Emma would have. She always wanted girls." Evelyn said nothing, waiting. Not saying that as He stopped again. I'm just saying it. I don't know how to talk to people. I forget sometimes. It's all right, Evelyn said. And surprisingly, it was. They sat in the dark for a while, not talking, which turned out to be its own kind of conversation. The piano happened on a Sunday in September. Evelyn had been careful to keep the girls out of the small parlor room, not from any instruction Caleb had given, but from her own instinct. That was the room with the 2 chairs and the piano and the framed photograph on the mantel, and that room belonged to who this house used to be. But she'd gotten absorbed in an accounting problem Maggie had brought her and lost track of Lily. And when she went looking, she found Lily standing in the doorway of the parlor room with her hand on the doorframe, not going in. Lily. I'm not touching it, Lily said. I'm just listening. Listening to what? To what it would sound like. She turned her head slightly as if hearing something. The A above middle C is probably flat. The tuning wire looks worn. Evelyn stood beside her daughter and looked at the piano. You can tell that by looking? I can tell that by looking and by the way this kind of piano goes after a few years without tuning. Lily had played for 3 years before Thomas died and the money for lessons ran out. The teacher in Wichita had said she had the most precise ear she'd encountered in a child, which had pleased Evelyn and made Thomas uncomfortable in a way he didn't articulate, but that Evelyn had understood was about what music could mean for a girl and what that meaning implied about leaving, about wanting things, about being the kind of person who might eventually require more than a farm in Kansas could give her. Don't touch it, Evelyn said again. Mama. Lily looked at her with the particular weariness of an 8-year-old who knows she's right. I'm not going to break it by playing it. Playing it is how you don't break a piano. That evening, Evelyn approached Caleb at supper. She waited until he'd finished eating, which was something she'd learned about him. He didn't like conversation during meals, not from rudeness, but because eating was when he was also thinking, organizing the next day's work in his head, and interrupting it irritated him in a small and genuine way. Lily plays piano, she said, when he'd pushed his plate back. He looked at her, said nothing. She's good. She was trained. Evelyn kept her voice level. I don't know who played yours. I want to ask permission before she touches it. It's your house and your piano, and I won't have her treating it as if she has rights she doesn't have. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Emma played, he said. It needs tuning. I can't tune it, and I don't know anyone who can. He picked up his coffee cup. If Lily can play it, she can play it. Lily played that evening for 2 hours, and the sound of it moved through the house in a way that changed the quality of the air. Even Caleb, who came in from the barn for something and stopped in the kitchen doorway, stood there for a moment before remembering what he'd come in for. Grace found Evelyn in the kitchen afterward, eyes shining. Mama, she said, it's like she came back. Evelyn turned away before her daughter could see her face. The animals were Grace's territory, and nobody had planned it that way. It simply happened as natural things will. Grace had always been quiet around animals. Not timid, but quiet in the specific way that meant she was listening, waiting, letting them come to her rather than going to them. On the 3rd day at the ranch, Caleb's dog, an elderly border collie named Roy, who had been moving around the place with the careful dignity of a dog who is conserving his remaining energy, appeared in the kitchen doorway while Grace was sitting on the floor playing with a rock she'd found, and Roy walked directly to her and put his head in her lap. Caleb had stared at this for a moment from the doorway. He doesn't do that, he said. He knows things, Grace said seriously and scratched behind Roy's ears. Within 2 weeks, Grace was following Caleb to the barn on mornings when he did the early feed, silent and careful, just watching. He'd stopped telling her to go back inside. She'd learned the names of each horse, their particular habits and preferences, which ones were moody in the morning and which ones needed to be approached from the left. When one of the mares developed a small wound on her cannon bone from a wire fence, Grace was the one who cleaned it every morning without being asked, and she cleaned it the right way. Carefully, without fuss, talking to the horse in a quiet, steady voice that kept the animal still. She's got a gift, Caleb said to Evelyn one evening. Not in a sentimental way, just stating a fact, the way he stated most things. I know, Evelyn said. You should let her spend more time with the animals. Evelyn looked at him. I am letting her. He nodded, as if this was satisfactory. Then he said, without particular transition, How are you doing? Evelyn blinked. Excuse me? You. How are you doing? He didn't say it with great warmth or particular sensitivity. He said it the way he said everything, direct and a little flat, like a question that deserved an answer, and he was waiting for one. "I'm fine," she said. "You don't sleep well." He picked up his coffee. "I hear you moving around at night, downstairs sometimes. I don't care. It's not keeping me up. I'm just noting it." Evelyn felt a flush of something. Embarrassment, maybe, or irritation, or both. "I have trouble sleeping. It's temporary." "I had trouble sleeping for about 2 years," he said, "after Emma and the baby." He drank his coffee. "It gets better, slower than you want, but it does." She didn't say anything for a moment. "Thank you," she said finally, "for telling me that." He nodded once and took his coffee to the barn. The letter arrived on a Friday, the 15th of October, almost exactly 2 months after the auction. It came from a courthouse in Wichita, formal letterhead, and it informed Evelyn Carter, addressed to Caleb Mercer as her legal contractor, that a complaint had been filed by one Hector Blaine, alleging that the labor contract arrangement had been obtained through coercive bidding practices, and that the undersigned requested a formal review of the custody arrangements for the minors named in the contract, with particular attention to the welfare of the children and the fitness of the current household. Caleb read it twice. Then he put it on the table and looked at it for a moment. "What does it mean?" Maggie asked. She'd been doing accounts at the other end of the table and had, with the efficient curiosity she applied to everything, read it upside down. "It means," Caleb said carefully, "that your mother's former guardian wants to get you back." "He can't," Maggie said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement made with the confidence of someone who has not yet learned how many things turn out to be possible despite seeming impossible. Evelyn was standing by the window. Outside, Grace was in the corral with the old mare, walking slow circles, her hand on the horse's neck. Lily was on the porch with a piece of music paper she'd found, writing something down. The afternoon light was going golden over the grassland. "We'll fight it," Caleb said. Evelyn turned from the window. "You don't have to—" "I know I don't have to." His voice was even. "We'll fight it. I'll go to Dodge on Monday and talk to a lawyer." He paused. "He's not getting you back. Not any of you." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. Outside, Grace laughed at something the horse did. A real laugh, the kind Grace had not produced in months. And the sound of it came through the open window and sat in the kitchen between them. "All right," Evelyn said. She turned back to the window. The afternoon light was still going golden, and Grace was still laughing, and the sound of it didn't stop, and Evelyn let herself stand there and listen to it for a little while before she went to help Lily with what she was writing down. The lawyer Caleb found in Dodge City was named Gerald Fitch, and he was not an impressive man to look at. He was thin and pale and wore a brown suit that had seen better years, and he had the particular manner of a man who had spent decades sitting in small offices listening to people describe situations that were worse than the people understood them to be. He listened to Caleb's account of the auction and the letter from Wichita without changing his expression, made notes in a cramped hand, and when Caleb finished, he set down his pen. "Blaine has standing," Fitch said. "Not strong standing, but standing. He was the court-appointed guardian. The original guardianship papers weren't dissolved when you purchased the contract. They were superseded, which is different. He can argue the supersession was procedurally improper." "The bidding was open," Caleb said. "I paid a fair price." "I believe you. The question is whether a judge in Wichita will believe you after Blaine's lawyer finishes characterizing the auction." Fitch tapped his pen on the desk. "Blaine is claiming coercive bidding, essentially that your intervention disrupted a legitimate process and the family was improperly removed from his authority. It's thin, but thin is enough to get a hearing." "What do we need to show?" "That Mrs. Carter and the children are well maintained, not coerced, and that their current situation serves their welfare better than any alternative Blaine can offer." Fitch paused. "And you'll need Mrs. Carter present at the hearing. Her testimony will matter more than yours." Caleb looked at the window. The street outside was busy with the usual Dodge City traffic. Wagons, horses, men moving between the storefronts with the purposeful walk of people who have somewhere to be. He'd driven up that morning before dawn, and he wanted to be back at the ranch by nightfall. "When's the hearing?" he asked. "They want it within 30 days. Fitch looked at his notes. "I can push for 45. You'll want the time." Evelyn took the news the way she took most things. without visible reaction in the moment, and then alone afterward where no one could watch. She was in the kitchen garden when Caleb found her on his return, pulling up the last of the fall vegetables before the hard frost came. It was the kind of work she did when she needed to think, physical and repetitive, with something to show for it at the end. He told her about Fitch and the 30 days and what they'd need to demonstrate. She pulled turnips while he talked, her hands steady and efficient in the soil. When he finished, she said, "He's not going to stop." "No. Even if we win this hearing, he'll find another angle." "Probably." Caleb crouched down to help her with the pile, which she hadn't asked him to do. "We deal with what's in front of us." Evelyn sat back on her heels and looked at him. There was dirt on her hands and her apron and a streak of it on her jaw that she didn't know about. "You have to understand what you're putting yourself in the middle of," she said. "Hector Blaine is connected to people. He knows the county clerk in Meade and someone in the state assembly. He doesn't lose things without making it expensive for the other side. I've dealt with men like Blaine before, not over women and children you have no legal claim to." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "I have the contract. A contract he's challenging." She turned back to the garden. "If this gets ugly, it gets ugly for you too. Your reputation, your business dealings. You've been farming this county for 15 years. I won't be the reason that changes." He was quiet long enough that she thought the conversation was over. Then he said, "You're doing that thing where you try to talk someone out of helping you." Evelyn stopped. "Excuse me? You've been doing it since the day I brought you here. Every time I do something, you say some version of 'you don't have to,' or 'I can manage on my own,' or 'here's why this is too much trouble.'" He wasn't looking at her. He was pulling turnips with the same steady efficiency she'd been using. "I noticed it early, and I didn't say anything because I figured it wasn't my place. But we've got 30 days, and I need you to stop doing it." The garden was quiet. A crow went over somewhere. "I'm trying," Evelyn said after a moment, "to be realistic." "I know what you're trying to do." He glanced at her sidelong. "It's not the same thing." She didn't respond to that. She went back to the turnips and he helped her finish the row, and neither of them said much else, but something had shifted between them in a way that couldn't be unshifted. The months that had passed since August had changed the girls in ways that Evelyn watched with something that wasn't quite peace but was moving in that direction. Maggie had reorganized the ranch accounts entirely, not in a dramatic way. She hadn't announced it or made a project of it. But over the course of 6 weeks, she had quietly gone through every ledger Caleb had going back 3 years, cross-referenced the livestock records against the sales figures, and produced a single page of handwritten corrections and recommendations that she left on the kitchen table one evening without comment. Caleb had read it at breakfast the next morning. He'd read it again. Then he'd looked at Maggie, who was eating her oatmeal without looking at him, and said, "Where'd you learn to do this?" "I taught myself from the books," she said, "and the ones in your accounting ledger. Your predecessor kept better records than you do." "That was my wife." Maggie looked up at him. "Then she was good at it." "She was." He folded the page carefully and put it in his shirt pocket. "I'm going to Dodge next Tuesday. You want to come?" Maggie's expression didn't change dramatically, but something lit up behind her eyes. "Yes," she said. Evelyn watched this from the stove and said nothing. The trip to Dodge had been its own event. Caleb had taken Maggie to the agricultural merchant to discuss the hay pricing she'd flagged, and Maggie had, as Caleb reported it later, with a kind of wondering flatness, sat across from a grown man with 20 years of business experience and explained with documentation precisely why the pricing structure was unfair and what the market rate justified. The merchant had blustered. Maggie had waited. The merchant had come down 30%. "She didn't raise her voice once," Caleb said to Evelyn that evening. "She never does," Evelyn said. "That's how she wins." He shook his head slowly. "She's something." "Yes," Evelyn said. "She is." What Evelyn had not expected, what she had not let herself expect, was that the ranch would start to feel like something other than a temporary arrangement. It happened the way most things happened in her experience. Not all at once, not with any single definable moment, but in accumulation. The way the kitchen came to smell like her cooking rather than like someone else's absence. The way Grace had claimed the barn cat for her own and named him something she refused to tell anyone. just calling him cat to their faces and something else entirely under her breath when she thought no one was listening. The way Lily's music had become part of the rhythm of the house in the evenings after supper, the piano carrying through the thin walls in a way that made even the silences feel different. And the way Evelyn herself had begun, slowly, reluctantly, with the awareness of doing it, to stop calculating her exit. She had been calculating it since the first day. Every decision, every arrangement, every piece of household management she put in place had been done with one eye on the question of how easily it could be unwound. Don't plant too deep. Don't let the girls attach too firmly. Keep the exit visible. But exits are hard to keep visible when you're busy keeping 4 people alive and a ranch functioning. And somewhere in the middle of October, she'd stopped seeing it clearly. She noticed this one night when she was mending a shirt of Caleb's. She'd taken over the mending as a practical matter, since his mending had been catastrophic, great lumpy knots of thread that she'd undone and redone properly, and realized she was thinking about what to plant in the kitchen garden come spring. Not as an abstract exercise, as a plan. She sat with the shirt in her hands for a moment. Then she finished the mending and went to bed and didn't think about it further, which was its own kind of answer. The afternoon that changed things between her and Caleb, or rather, the afternoon that made visible the thing that had already changed, happened on a cold Wednesday in early November, when a norther blew in fast from the high plains and dropped the temperature 20 degrees in the space of an hour. Caleb had been out checking the south fence line and hadn't made it back before the wind hit. Evelyn had the girls inside, the stove going, the animals seen to. Grace had insisted on helping with the barn, and Evelyn had let her because Grace was more competent with the horses than she was, and both of them knew it. She'd been watching the horizon for Caleb's return since mid-afternoon. He came in at nearly 5, cold through, his coat frozen stiff at the collar, and his hands red and clumsy. He didn't say anything when he came through the door, just went to the stove and stood with his back to it. Evelyn poured coffee without being asked and handed it to him. He took it with both hands and drank half of it before he looked at her. South fence is down in 3 places, he said. Cattle are scattered. I'll need to go back out in the morning. How bad? Could be worse. He drank more coffee. Could be better. She turned back to the stove. Supper was biscuits and the last of a venison roast she'd stretched through 3 days. And she was making gravy that she wanted to be right because the cold made everyone want something substantial. You were watching for me, he said. It was not a question. She'd been at the window when he came up the path. I was keeping an eye on the weather, she said. He was quiet behind her. Evelyn? His voice was different. Not softer exactly, but more careful, the way he got when he was about to say something he'd thought about. Don't. She kept her back to him. I haven't said anything yet. I know what you're going to say. Do you? He wasn't pushing, just stating. She turned around because having her back to him felt wrong, like she was retreating. We have a hearing in 3 weeks, and a man who wants to take my daughters, and the situation is complicated enough without adding... She stopped. Without adding what? He was watching her with those dark eyes, level and patient. Without adding anything, she said. He nodded slowly. All right. She went back to the gravy. It needed stirring. I'm not good at this, he said from behind her. I was married for 12 years, and I was not a particularly easy man to be married to. Emma would tell you herself if she could. A pause. I forget what I'm trying to say when I'm trying to say something. I work better when I'm not saying anything. Then don't say anything, Evelyn said. I just want you to know that I'm not looking for a housekeeper. He said it quickly, the way he said things he'd been rehearsing. I know that's what the contract says. I know that's what this looks like from the outside, but that's not... He stopped, started again. The day I bought that contract, I wasn't thinking about having someone to cook and keep the house. I wasn't thinking about the money or the labor. Another pause. I just couldn't stand watching it anymore. The gravy was at risk of burning if she didn't keep her attention on it. She kept her attention on it. That doesn't resolve anything, she said after a moment. I know. We still have the hearing. We still have Blaine. I know that too. And I'm not, she made herself say it, I'm not in a place where I can think about much beyond getting through the next month. I'm not asking you to. He picked up his coffee again. I just wanted you to know where I stood. So there's no confusion about what I'm doing here and why. The gravy was done. She took it off the heat. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me." He nodded. They didn't look at each other directly. The stove ticked and the wind moved around the house, and somewhere upstairs, very faintly, Lily was playing scales. The deposition for the Wichita hearing required Evelyn to appear before a notary in Dodge and give a formal statement about the conditions of her guardianship under Hector Blaine. Fitch had prepared her carefully, what to include, what to lead with, what to leave for the courtroom. What Fitch had not prepared her for was how it felt to say it out loud, officially, to a stranger with a pen. She sat across from the notary, a heavy-set woman named Mrs. Croft, with efficient hands and a neutral expression, and described the past year in the flat, precise language of legal testimony, and the flat precision of it made it worse somehow, made it more real than it had been when it was just something that had happened to her. The boarding house rooms. The papers she'd signed without understanding. The conversation with Blaine where he'd used her daughters as leverage. The platform in Red Creek, and the crowd, and the hammer. She got through all of it without breaking, which she was proud of, and then Mrs. Croft asked her to describe the moment she understood what the auction meant for her daughters, and Evelyn stopped talking for about 30 seconds. Mrs. Croft waited. "My daughter Maggie," Evelyn said finally. She was standing on that platform and she had gone completely still. She does that when she's frightened. She goes still and her face goes blank and she looks about 40 years old. She kept her voice even. She's 9. She shouldn't know how to do that. She learned it because she had to. She paused. That was when I understood. Mrs. Croft wrote something. She didn't look up. Evelyn looked at the wall. Outside, through the window, she could hear the street sounds of Dodge City. Wagons, voices, a horse's hooves on packed dirt. Ordinary sounds. The sounds of a world going about its business, while other things happened inside closed rooms. "Thank you, Mrs. Carter," Mrs. Croft said, when they were done. "The statement is complete." Evelyn sat for a moment before she stood. "Is that enough?" she asked. "What I gave you is it enough?" Mrs. Croft looked at her. For a moment, the neutral expression did something complicated. "I've seen a great many of these statements," she said. "What I can tell you is that yours is among the clearest I've recorded." She capped her pen. "I hope it serves you well." It wasn't an answer, but it was something. The 30 days between the letter and the hearing were not 30 easy days, and they were not 30 days during which nothing else happened, because the ranch did not stop having needs simply because Hector Blaine had filed papers in Wichita. There was a cattle illness in early November, a respiratory thing that moved through 6 of the younger steers and cost Caleb 2 of them before he got it under control. There was a broken axle on the freight wagon that needed a part from Dodge, and a week's wait, and meanwhile the hay delivery was late, and the barn roof developed a leak over the east stall and needed patching before the first real snow. Caleb managed all of this with the grim efficiency of a man who has managed hard things before and does not expect them to stop. Evelyn managed the house and the accounts, Maggie now officially doing the accounts, with Evelyn reviewing, and the endless domestic machinery of feeding and clothing and maintaining 4 people through a Kansas autumn. What surprised her was how much she didn't mind it. That was the honest truth, the one she examined in the small hours when she couldn't sleep and the house was quiet. She did not mind the work. She had worked hard her entire life, and she would work hard her entire life, and that was simply what it was. But there was a quality to this work that was different from anything before it, and the difference was that this work was building something rather than merely sustaining it. The accounts Maggie kept were their accounts. The garden she planned for spring was their garden. The barn cat Grace refused to officially name but unofficially called Marshall, she'd heard her one morning whispering it, was their barn cat. It had stopped being Caleb's ranch in some quiet inner way that she didn't know how to categorize. She thought about Thomas and the way she'd been able to think about him recently. Not the sharp grief of the first months, but the particular complicated feeling of remembering a person fully, good and bad together. Thomas had been kind and sometimes wonderful, and he had also, in a way that she now understood better than she had when he was alive, been afraid. Afraid of being less than he thought he should be, which had made him hide things from her, which had put them here. She didn't blame him for it. She had her own fears that drove her to their own damages. But she thought about it. She thought Caleb was also afraid, though of different things and in different ways. He was afraid of opening and then losing again. She could see it in how he held himself back at the edges of things. Was generous but not expansive, present but with a margin of space always maintained. He was afraid of wanting something and having it taken. She understood that fear in her bones. She was beginning to understand, more tired of being ruled by it than she had previously admitted to herself. It was Maggie who noticed the man first. They'd been in Dodge for a supply run, Caleb and Evelyn and Maggie, the week before the hearing. Lily and Grace had stayed at the ranch with the neighbor's son who sometimes helped with the cattle, a taciturn 17-year-old named Webb, who Lily regarded with the distant, polite indifference she applied to most people outside her immediate family. The man was standing across from the general store. Evelyn didn't see him until Maggie touched her arm, quick and light, and tilted her head the smallest amount. He was heavy-set, 50s, brown coat. He was watching them with the studied casualness of someone who wants to appear not to be watching. Evelyn said nothing. She picked up the package Caleb had set on the wagon seat and carried it into the store. Caleb came in behind her. "You saw him." "Maggie did. He's been there since we arrived." Caleb kept his voice low and his expression neutral, the way you do when you know someone is watching and you don't want to acknowledge it. "Works for Blaine, I'd guess. Or a hired man of whoever Blaine hired." "He's building a case," Evelyn said. "Trying to." He set his list on the counter. "Let him watch. There's nothing to see. He's not looking for something. He's manufacturing something." Caleb glanced at her. "You think he'll lie?" "I think a man who sold a woman and her children on an auction block in broad daylight has a particular relationship to truth." She kept her voice even. "Yes, I think he'll lie." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Fitch will have dealt with this before." "Probably." "And your statement is solid." "I think so." Then he stopped. He was not good at the reassuring kind of conversation, and both of them knew it, and he seemed to be trying to find the version of it he could manage. "We've done what we can do," he said finally. "What's left is just showing up and saying the truth." It wasn't comforting exactly. It was the kind of thing he said. Straightforward, no embellishment, just the plain shape of the situation. And yet somehow it was what she needed. Not comfort, just the plain shape. "All right," she said. She turned to the counter and gave her list to the merchant, and outside through the window the man in the brown coat was still watching, and she looked directly at him for a moment without flinching before she looked away. The hearing was set for the 18th of November, in a courthouse in Wichita. Fitch had arranged 2 witnesses to speak to Caleb's character, a neighboring rancher named Patterson, who'd known him 15 years, and the Dodge agricultural merchant that Maggie had negotiated down, who had apparently been sufficiently impressed by the experience that he was willing to make the trip. Evelyn had her own witness, which she had arranged herself without telling Caleb. He found out 3 days before the hearing when a letter arrived addressed to her from a Mrs. Dorothy Crane of Red Creek, confirming her attendance. "Who is Dorothy Crane?" he asked. "She was at the auction." Evelyn folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket. "She was one of the women I saw near the dry goods store." She shook her head. "I remembered her face." She paused. "I wrote to her 2 weeks ago. I found her name from the Red Creek church register through Fitch." Caleb looked at her for a moment. "How did you know she'd come?" "I didn't. I asked." She turned back to the dough she was kneading. "She wrote back in 4 days. She said she'd been thinking about that day since August, and she was glad someone finally asked." He was quiet. "You didn't think I could put a case together," Evelyn said. "Not accusing, just noting." "I didn't think you'd have time with everything else." Women do not generally have the luxury of doing one thing at a time. The dough came together under her hands. "I've been gathering evidence since the day you brought us here. Every conversation with the girls, every record of their progress, every note about what they could and couldn't do when we arrived versus what they can do now." She looked at him. "I'm not going into that courtroom empty-handed." Caleb Mercer looked at Evelyn Carter standing at his kitchen table with flour on her hands and that direct gray-green gaze and said nothing for a long moment. "No," he said finally. "You're not." He took his hat from the hook and went out, and Evelyn went back to the dough. And she thought about what was coming and what it would cost and what it might mean, and she kneaded the bread with more force than strictly necessary and let the thinking happen and then let it go. The night before they left for Wichita, Lily played for a long time after supper, longer than usual. She played through the simple pieces she'd relearned first, the exercises and scales that had brought her hands back to where they'd been before the months of no piano. And then she played something that wasn't anything Evelyn recognized. She stood in the doorway and listened. "Is that yours?" she asked when Lily paused. Lily looked up. She'd forgotten anyone was there. "I've been working on it," she said. I don't have a name for it." Evelyn came into the room and sat in the chair near the window. "Play it from the beginning." Lily played it from the beginning. It was not a polished piece. There were places where she hesitated, where a chord change wasn't quite resolved, where the melody did something tentative. But there was something in it that was entirely Lily, some particular quality of attention and feeling that Evelyn recognized from her daughter's earliest playing before Thomas died, before everything. When she finished, Evelyn sat quietly for a moment. "It sounds like here," she said. Lily looked at the keys. "I know." She pressed one note softly. "Is that all right?" "Yes," Evelyn said. "That's all right." Lily played the note again. Outside, the Kansas night was enormous and dark and cold, and somewhere out there Hector Blaine was building his case, and in 3 days they would go to Wichita and stand in a courtroom and say the truth and hope it was enough. And here, in this room, with the piano and the lamplight and her daughter's hands on the keys, Evelyn let herself feel what she'd been managing rather than feeling for months. She was afraid. She was also, for the first time in a long time, unwilling to let the fear decide. That was different. That was something she could work with. Grace appeared in the doorway in her nightgown, her hair loose, the barn cat Marshall tucked under her arm. "I heard the music," she said. "Come in," Evelyn said. Grace came in and climbed into the chair next to her mother and put her head on Evelyn's shoulder, and Marshall arranged himself across both their laps with the sovereign comfort of a cat who considers all furniture to be his furniture. Lily began to play again, the unnamed piece from the beginning, quieter this time, and the three of them sat in the lamplight while the wind moved around the house outside and the notes filled the room up to its edges. Maggie appeared 5 minutes later, saw them, and sat on the floor without a word, her back against the chair leg, her knees pulled up. She had a pencil in her hand. She always had a pencil. They stayed like that until the piece ended the second time, and then Lily closed the piano gently, and the room went to ordinary quiet, and Evelyn looked at her daughters. This impossible collection of fierce and tender and stubborn people she had made, and thought, with a clarity that cut through everything else, whatever happens in that courtroom, they have already become who they are going to be. Nobody could take that back. Not Hector Blaine, not any courthouse in Kansas. She got up and told them it was time for bed, and they went, and she banked the stove and turned down the lamps and stood alone in the kitchen for a minute before she went upstairs. Outside, the wind had died. The prairie was very still. They left for Wichita before dawn. Caleb had the wagon loaded the night before. The good horses, not the work team, because the road was long, and he wanted animals with reserve in them. Evelyn had packed food for the journey and a separate bag with the documents she'd assembled over the past weeks. The ledger pages Maggie had annotated, a written account of the girls' condition when they arrived at the ranch versus their condition now, a letter from the Dodge merchant confirming the business transaction with Maggie, and her own formal statement from Mrs. Croft's notary office, sealed and ribboned in the way that legal documents were supposed to be. She'd gone through the bag 3 times before she finally closed it. The girls rode in the wagon bed under quilts, Grace asleep again within the first 20 minutes, Lily watching the darkness outside with that particular quality of attention she brought to things she was trying to memorize. Maggie sat up front between Evelyn and Caleb, which was where she always positioned herself when given the choice, as if proximity to decision-making was its own form of participation. The road to Wichita was 2 days in good conditions. The conditions were not good. A cold snap had turned the ruts to iron, and the wagon shuddered over them, and the horses had to work for every mile. Caleb drove without complaint. Evelyn sat with her hands in her lap and watched the Kansas prairie lighten from black to gray to the particular pale gold of a winter dawn, and tried not to rehearse what she was going to say in the courtroom because every time she rehearsed it, some piece of it sounded wrong to her and she'd have to start over. "Stop thinking about it," Caleb said without looking at her. You've been clenching your jaw for an hour." He shifted the reins. "You know what you're going to say. You've known it longer than you've had the words for it." Maggie looked up from the ledger page she'd been reviewing by the pre-dawn light, which was a feat of eyesight that Evelyn found slightly alarming. "He's right," she said. "You always know. You just think you have to make it more official." "Thank you, Maggie," Evelyn said. "I'm just saying." Evelyn looked out at the road. The sun was a thin red line at the horizon. "I know what I'm going to say," she said, to herself as much as to anyone. "I just don't know if it'll be enough." Caleb said nothing, but he moved the reins to one hand, and with the other he briefly covered her folded hands where they sat in her lap, just for a moment, just the weight and warmth of it, and then moved his hand back to the reins. Maggie had very deliberately gone back to her ledger page. They stopped the first night at a way station outside of Pratt, a rough establishment with 2 rooms for travelers and food that was edible if not distinguished. Fitch met them there. He'd traveled down from Wichita and would ride back with them in the morning. He looked tired and was carrying a leather case that appeared to have multiplied in size since Caleb had last seen him. He went through the case with Evelyn at the way station's single table, while the girls slept and Caleb sat near the door with coffee that was mostly hot water and said nothing. "Blaine's lawyer is a man named Custer," Fitch said. "Not a bad lawyer. He'll try to make the auction look like a rescue operation gone wrong, that Blaine was placing the family out of genuine concern, and that Mercer's intervention disrupted a protective arrangement." "That's obscene," Evelyn said. "It's a legal argument. Obscene and legal aren't mutually exclusive." Fitch pulled out a paper. "He'll also try to establish that the current household arrangement is inappropriate, that an unmarried man and an unmarried woman living under the same roof with minor children constitutes an unsatisfactory moral environment." Evelyn looked at the table. "Of course he will. We get ahead of it. You testify first about the conditions of Blaine's guardianship, specific, dated, factual, the boarding house, the papers you signed, the conversation where he threatened you with state custody of the children, then the auction, then the current arrangements at the ranch." He looked at her. "The judge is a man named Harlan. He's been on the bench 12 years. He's not easily impressed, and he doesn't like emotional testimony to come, meaning don't perform for him. Just talk." "I don't perform," Evelyn said. Fitch looked at her steadily. "I know. That's why I think we have a chance. Yeah." The Wichita courthouse was a brick building on a wide street, more substantial than anything Red Creek had to offer. Evelyn had been in Wichita once before, years ago, with Thomas, a supply run that had taken 2 days and felt like a small adventure. She remembered the city as busy and loud and slightly overwhelming after the quiet of the farm. Now it just looked like a place where things were decided. They arrived mid-morning. Dorothy Crane was waiting on the steps, a woman in her 60s with white hair and a good wool coat, and the particular bearing of a woman who has decided to do something and will not be talked out of it. She had driven up from Red Creek the day before and stayed at a boarding house. She greeted Evelyn with a handshake that was firm and brief, and then she looked at the girls with an expression that moved through several things quickly. "I should have spoken up in August," she said. "I've thought about it every day since." "You're here now," Evelyn said. "That's what my husband said. Took him 3 tries to get me to hear it." She looked up at the courthouse. "Well, let's go do this." Patterson, the neighboring rancher, was already inside, sitting in the hallway outside the courtroom with the composed patience of a man who spends most of his time outdoors and finds indoor waiting comparatively easy. He nodded to Caleb when they came in, and to Evelyn, and then looked at the girls with the same careful blankness that people used when they were trying not to show that they knew what these children had been through. Hector Blaine arrived at 20 minutes to 10 with a lawyer and 2 men Evelyn didn't recognize, heavy-set and quiet, who positioned themselves against the wall like weight. Blaine himself looked, she thought, essentially as he always had, neat, self-contained, with that small smile that was his default expression and that she had finally, after all these months, correctly identified as the smile of a man who has never been seriously challenged and expects not to be. He caught her eye across the hallway. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds and then looked deliberately away. Not from discomfort, but because he wasn't worth more than 3 seconds. Judge Harlan was exactly what Fitch had described. He was in his 60s, lean, with a face that had settled into permanent skepticism, the way faces do when they've heard too many things over too many years. He ran his courtroom with a kind of spare efficiency that Evelyn respected. No excess ceremony, no performance, just the matter at hand. He looked at the papers before him when the session opened and then looked up at both tables. This is a review of guardianship and labor contract arrangements relating to Evelyn Carter and her 3 minor daughters, he said. I've read the filings. I want testimony, not arguments. We can argue at the end. He looked at Custer, Blaine's lawyer. Mr. Custer, your client filed the challenge. You go last. Mr. Fitch, you're defending the current arrangement. Let's hear from your witnesses first. Fitch nodded. Thank you, Your Honor. I'd like to call Mrs. Evelyn Carter. Saw it. The witness chair was the plain wooden chair beside the judge's bench. Evelyn sat down in it and looked at the courtroom. The gallery had perhaps 20 people, townspeople who had an interest or simply nothing else to do on a Tuesday morning. She recognized no one except her own people. Fitch at his table, Caleb beside him with his hat on his knee, the girls in the front row of the gallery with Dorothy Crane beside them. Maggie was sitting up very straight. Grace was pressed close to Mrs. Crane's arm. Lily was watching Evelyn with an expression of such concentrated attention that Evelyn felt it like a physical thing. She looked at Fitch. Mrs. Carter, he said, please describe in your own words the circumstances that led to the auction in Red Creek on August 14th of this year. She described it. She'd described it before. To Mrs. Croft, to Fitch in preparation, to herself in the small hours. And the practice had not made it less exactly, but had made it more manageable. She spoke about Thomas's illness and death, about the debts, about the letters that went unanswered. She spoke about Hector Blaine's appearances in April and May, his helpful manner, the lawyer's office in June. She described the papers she'd signed. Did you understand what those papers meant at the time you signed them? Fitch asked. No, she said. I understood that I was authorizing Mr. Blaine to assist with managing the estate. I did not understand that I was authorizing him to make decisions about my labor and my children's labor, or to place us under contract without my individual consent to each arrangement. When did you understand the full extent of what you'd signed? When he told me about the auction. She kept her voice level. He described it as a labor placement system. He said it was legal. When I said we weren't property, he told me that if I refused to cooperate, the state had facilities for children in difficult circumstances. She paused. He meant it as a threat. He delivered it that way. And he was right that it was legal, which is its own problem. Fitch let that sit for a moment. Please describe the conditions of the boarding house where you and your daughters were held under Mr. Blaine's guardianship. She described it. 2 rooms, 1 window. The month and a half during which their movements were restricted, their money inaccessible, their communications monitored. She'd found out later that Blaine had been having his man at the boarding house read any letters that came for her, which explained why 2 of the letters she'd written during that period had gone unanswered from people who later said they'd never received them. And the day of the auction, can you describe what happened on the platform? She described it, the crowd, the auctioneer's voice, the numbers going up, her daughters on the platform beside her. At what point did you understand the full impact of what was happening on your daughters? She had known this question was coming. She'd thought about how to answer it and had decided the only answer worth giving was the true one. My daughter Margaret, Maggie. She's 9 years old, Evelyn said. She's been serious since she was small, and the past year made her more serious. On the platform, she went completely still. Her face went blank. She looked like a woman of 40 making herself endure something. She stopped for a second. I thought, she should not know how to do that. No child should. She learned it because the year we'd had taught it to her. Malbo, short. Another pause. That was when I understood what I was watching happen to them. The courtroom was quiet. Thank you, Mrs. Carter, Fitch said. No further questions. 18. Custer was a competent lawyer in the way that a well-maintained machine is competent. He operated correctly and without wasted motion. He stood up and straightened his papers and looked at Evelyn with professional pleasantness. Mrs. Carter, you've described Mr. Blaine's guardianship in quite negative terms. However, is it not true that during the 6 weeks of his guardianship, you and your daughters were fed, housed, and clothed? We were housed in 2 rooms and fed at the boarding house's standard rate, which Mr. Blaine was billing to my estate account, meaning I was paying for my own captivity. She kept her tone even. So yes, we were fed and housed. A small sound in the gallery. Judge Harlan didn't react. You've characterized Mr. Blaine's behavior as threatening. But isn't it possible he was simply explaining the legal realities of your situation? A man who explains legal realities to a woman while using her children as the example of what happens if she doesn't comply is threatening her, Evelyn said. The word legal doesn't change what it is. Custer moved on smoothly. You're currently living in the household of Mr. Caleb Mercer, an unmarried man. Can you describe the sleeping arrangements? I have my own room. My daughters share 2 rooms. Mr. Mercer has his own room. She looked at Custer. If you're suggesting what I believe you're suggesting, I'd encourage you to make the suggestion plainly so we can address it plainly. Custer smiled. I'm simply establishing the domestic arrangements for the court's understanding. The domestic arrangements are that Mr. Mercer provided my daughters and me with shelter and work and has treated us with more basic decency in 3 months than Mr. Blaine managed in 6 weeks. She held Custer's gaze. If that's unsuitable to the court, I'd like to understand on what grounds. Judge Harlan made a small sound that might have been clearing his throat. It might have been something else. Nothing further, Custer said. Patterson testified to Caleb's character in the deliberate way of a man who doesn't use words unless they mean something. That he had known Caleb Mercer for 15 years. That he had never known him to behave dishonestly in a business dealing or otherwise. That his ranch was well run and his dealings in the county were respected. He said this in 4 sentences and then declined to elaborate because elaboration wasn't his way and he'd said what he came to say. The Dodge merchant, a man named Abernethy who had more natural comfort in front of people than Patterson, testified to the conversation with Maggie and what it had demonstrated. She came into my office with her mother's permission, he said, and she showed me a 3-year accounting error in our pricing agreement. 9 years old. She was polite and she was right. He paused. I've done business with a lot of people. I don't see organizational capability like that very often, regardless of age. Custer asked if it was possible the child had been coached or manipulated. Abernethy considered this with genuine seriousness. I suppose anything's possible, he said, but she answered follow-up questions I asked on the spot that nobody could have prepared her for. Either she understood the numbers or she didn't. She understood them. Dorothy Crane took the stand last before the lunch recess, and she was the most interesting witness because she was the most uncomfortable one. She sat in the chair with her hands folded in her lap and her white hair very neat and described what she had seen in Red Creek on the 14th of August, with the particular manner of a woman who is making herself look at something she would prefer to look away from. I was standing near the dry goods store, she said. I was there to pick up fabric. I saw the announcement about the auction. Labor contracts, they said. I knew what that meant. I'd heard about it before, but I'd never seen it. She looked at her hands. I stood there and watched. A woman and 3 little girls on a platform. The auctioneer calling numbers. She stopped. The youngest child was shaking. She grabbed her sister's hand. What did you do? Fitch asked. Mrs. Crane was quiet for a moment. Nothing, she said. I stood and watched. I shook my head to my friend beside me. I said it was terrible. She looked up. And then the gentleman at the back called out his price and bought the contract, and it was over. And everyone went home, and I went home, and I've thought about it every day since, because I should have said something before he did. I should have spoken up before it came to that. She looked at the judge. I can tell you what I saw on that platform. I can tell you what those children looked like. Nobody in that courtroom wanted to see what I saw on the faces of those girls, so they didn't look. I looked. I should have done more than look. The courtroom was very quiet. Thank you, Mrs. Crane, Fitch said gently. After the lunch recess, Fitch asked Judge Harlan's permission to call the Carter children. Custer objected briefly and without great conviction, and Harlan overruled him with the air of a man who had already made up his mind about the objection. Caleb leaned to Fitch. Is this necessary? If you want the court to see what 3 months has actually done, yes. Fitch kept his voice low. Blaine's going to argue the ranch isn't a suitable environment. The best rebuttal is the children themselves. They'd talked to the girls the night before, in the way station, Evelyn and Caleb together, about what the courtroom might be like and what they might be asked. Evelyn had been careful not to tell them what to say. She'd told them to say what was true, and nothing more, and nothing less, and if they didn't know something, to say so. Maggie went first. She walked to the witness chair with the posture she always had. Straight, deliberate, like she'd decided exactly how she was going to hold herself and didn't see any reason to change it. She sat down and looked at Fitch and waited. Fitch was careful with her. He asked her about her life at the ranch in general terms, what her days were like, what work she did, what she learned. She answered everything directly, without embellishment, in the particular economy of someone who respects language enough not to waste it. "Do you feel safe at Twin Pines Ranch?" Fitch asked. Maggie considered this in the way she considered most things, briefly but visibly, as if checking her own assessment before committing to it. "Yes," she said. "Is there anything about your situation there that concerns you or frightens you?" "The hearing," she said. Fitch paused. "Can you explain what you mean?" "I mean that the hearing concerns me because the outcome is uncertain, and the uncertainty is unpleasant." She looked at the judge with the directness she brought to most people. "I'm not frightened of Mr. Mercer or the ranch or my mother's ability to manage things. I'm frightened of people I don't know making decisions about my life based on what they think is best for me." She paused. "That's happened before. It didn't go well." Judge Harlan looked at her for a long moment. His face gave nothing away. Custer's cross-examination of Maggie was brief and visibly careful. He had enough experience to recognize an unfavorable witness when he saw one, and Maggie was an extremely unfavorable witness. He asked her 2 questions about the domestic arrangements at the ranch, received 2 precise and unhelpful to him answers, and sat down. Lily went next. She was quieter than Maggie on the stand, but not from lack of confidence, from a different kind of interior life. She answered questions about the piano and her playing with the careful precision of someone describing something important in language that might not be adequate to it. "What did it mean to you, having access to the piano again?" Fitch asked. Lily thought about this for a moment. "Before my father died, I played every day. After, I didn't play for almost a year. I couldn't." She paused. "When I played at the ranch the first time, I realized I'd forgotten what it felt like to be the person who plays. Not just to make music, but to be someone who does that. Who that's part of." She looked at Fitch. "I don't know how to say it more precisely than that." "You don't need to," he said. Grace was last. She was 7 years old and small for it, and she sat in the witness chair with her feet not quite reaching the floor, and she looked at the courtroom with the wide, dark eyes she'd had since birth that gave her the permanent appearance of paying very close attention. Fitch crouched slightly as he approached her, not in a condescending way, but to bring himself closer to her level. "Grace," he said, "can you tell me about Marshall?" Grace blinked. "He's my cat. Tell me about him." "He came to me on the 3rd day," she said. "He's old. He has a torn ear from something that happened before I knew him." She considered. "He sleeps on the end of my bed. He doesn't like loud noises, but he doesn't run from them. He just gets very still and watches." A pause. "He trusts me." "Why do you think he trusts you?" Grace thought about it with complete seriousness. "Because I'm careful with him," she said. "And because I showed up every day, even when he wasn't sure about me yet. Animals know that. They know if you're going to keep showing up." The courtroom was very quiet again. Fitch said, "Are you happy at Twin Pines Ranch, Grace?" Grace looked at him. Then she looked at her mother, sitting behind the bar, and at Caleb beside her. Then she looked back at Fitch. "It's the first place that felt like ours," she said. Awesome. Blaine took the stand in the afternoon and was everything Evelyn had expected him to be: composed, reasonable sounding, deeply misleading. He described his guardianship as motivated purely by concern for a vulnerable widow and her children. He described the boarding house as comfortable and secure. He described the auction as a regrettable but legally sound mechanism for family placement. He described his filing of the legal challenge as an act of concern for the children's welfare in an unsuitable environment. He was good at it. Evelyn had known he would be. He'd had decades of practice presenting himself as reasonable to people who didn't know him well enough to see the machinery underneath. Fitch's cross was pointed. He asked about the specific language of the papers Evelyn had signed, making Blaine read certain passages aloud. And the passages were considerably broader than managing the estate, and the broadness was visible. He asked about the letters Evelyn had written that were never delivered, and Blaine said he was unaware of any such interference with correspondence. And the way he said it made Evelyn's jaw tighten. He asked about the placement fee Blaine received from labor contract auctions, and the amount, and whether the fee structure had any bearing on Blaine's decisions about his wards. "My fees are standard for the service I provide," Blaine said. "Your fees are paid by employers, correct? Not by the families you're supposed to be representing?" A pause. "That's the standard arrangement. So the more families you place, the more you earn." "I provide a service. The more families you place," Fitch said again. "Yes." Flat. "And in this case, you moved to placement within 6 weeks of assuming guardianship of a woman who had just lost her husband and farm and had no other support available to her." Fitch looked at his papers. 6 weeks. "Is that standard?" Another pause, slightly longer. "Each case is different." "Indeed, nothing further." The arguments came last, as Harlan had said they would. Custer made a reasonable argument about legal process and the court's interest in ensuring proper oversight of vulnerable families. He did not mention the moral environment argument again. Evelyn guessed that Maggie's testimony had made it unwise. Fitch made a shorter argument. He said that the law existed to protect people, and that when the law was being used to exploit the people it was meant to protect, the spirit of it required the court to look at what was actually happening rather than what was technically permitted. He said that the testimony of 3 children who had lived under both arrangements was perhaps the clearest evidence available. He said he trusted the court to see the difference. Harlan said he would have a ruling in the morning. The night was the hardest part. Fitch had arranged rooms at a boarding house near the courthouse. Better than the way station, real beds, and decent food. The girls were in one room, Evelyn and Mrs. Crane in another, Caleb in a room down the hall, Fitch and Patterson elsewhere. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed after the girls were asleep and felt the weight of the day on every part of her. Her daughters had testified in a courthouse at the ages of 9, 8, and 7 about their own well-being, which was not something any child should have to do, and they had done it with a composure that broke her heart in a particular quiet way. She heard footsteps in the hall and then a knock, soft, at her door. She opened it. Caleb stood in the hallway with his jacket off and his hair unsettled from the hat he'd had on all day, holding a cup. "Tea," he said. "The landlady had some." She took it. They stood in the doorway for a moment, neither of them speaking. "They did well today," he said. "They did." She cupped the tea in both hands. "Maggie's going to be furious about the waiting. She doesn't like uncertainty." "I know." Something moved across his face. "She's going to be all right, all of them." "You don't know that." "No." He leaned against the doorframe. "But I think it." Evelyn looked down at the tea. "Harlan could still rule against us." "He could." "If he does, then we find another way." His voice was quiet and direct. "That's what you do with things that don't go the way you need. You find another way." He looked at her. "I'm not going to pretend this is certain. I know better than to pretend things are certain." A pause. "But I'm also not leaving. Whatever Harlan says tomorrow, I'm not leaving." She looked at him for a moment. The hallway was narrow and dim, and outside the building she could hear Wichita going about its nighttime business, indifferent to the small human dramas happening behind its walls. "I know," she said finally. She meant it as acknowledgement. It came out as something more than that, and she let it, and he heard it, and neither of them said anything further about it. "Get some sleep," he said. "You too." He went back down the hall. She closed the door softly and stood in the room with the tea going warm in her hands and listened to her daughters breathing in the next bed. The particular soft rhythm of children who are deeply asleep and temporarily safe, and she did not sleep for a long time, but she lay down and she was still, which was almost the same thing. The ruling came at 9 in the morning. Harlan had them all in the courtroom again. Both tables, the witnesses in the gallery. He came in without ceremony and sat and opened the file before him and read from it without looking up, which Evelyn had been told was his habit. He read through the procedural history first, which took several minutes, and during those minutes the courtroom was very quiet. Evelyn kept her hands flat on her knees. Beside her, Fitch sat with his pen ready. At the other table, Blaine was watching Harlan with an expression of careful confidence. "Having reviewed the testimony and the documentary evidence presented in this matter," Harlan said, still not looking up, "I find as follows." He found that the original guardianship papers were not improperly executed, but that their execution had relied on the ward's incomplete understanding of their scope, and that a guardian who exploited that incomplete understanding had not fulfilled his legal or ethical duty. He found that the labor auction mechanism, while technically permitted under current Kansas statute, had been applied in a manner inconsistent with the welfare of the family in question, specifically in the use of a threat relating to the minor children to compel the ward's compliance. He found that the current household arrangement at Twin Pines Ranch, based on the testimony presented, demonstrated measurable positive outcomes for all three minor children in the areas of education, emotional stability, and physical well-being. He found that no credible evidence had been presented of coercion or improper conduct on the part of the contract holder. He set down the paper and looked up for the first time. "The challenge is denied, Miss," he said. "Mrs. Carter and her daughters will remain in their current arrangement. Mr. Blaine's guardianship is formally dissolved." He looked at Blaine's table with an expression that did not change but contained something in it. "I'd further note that the practices described in today's testimony represent a use of legal mechanism that this court finds troubling, and I intend to make that finding part of the record in this case and to copy it to the relevant oversight body." He closed the file. "We're done here." The hammer came down. It was a smaller sound than the one at the Red Creek auction. Evelyn hadn't expected to notice that. She noticed it. Maggie, in the gallery, exhaled the longest breath Evelyn had ever heard from a 9-year-old. Grace grabbed Mrs. Crane's arm with both hands, and Mrs. Crane put her hand over Grace's and held it. Lily sat very still for a moment, and then her face did something that it very rarely did. It went entirely unguarded, entirely open, and what was on it was just relief, simple and absolute, the expression of someone who has been holding something heavy for a very long time and has just been allowed to put it down. Evelyn looked at Caleb. He was already looking at her. He nodded once. She nodded back. Across the room, Hector Blaine stood up from his chair and picked up his hat from the table and put it on with precise care. And then he walked out of the courtroom without looking at anyone, and his lawyer followed him, and the door closed behind them both. Evelyn watched it close. She had thought she would feel triumphant, or some version of it. Instead, she felt something quieter and more complicated. The particular feeling of a thing that has been fought for and won, which contains relief and exhaustion in roughly equal measure and does not feel like an ending because it isn't one. But it was something. It was enough for today. She stood up from her chair and turned to her daughters, who were making their way out of the gallery. Maggie first, serious-faced, but with her eyes very bright, then Lily, then Grace, who broke into something close to a run across the open space of the courtroom floor and hit Evelyn at mid-height with both arms around her waist and held on with the ferocity of a 7-year-old who has very strong feelings and no smaller way to show them. Evelyn held her daughter and looked over Grace's head at Caleb, who was standing near the rail with his hat in his hands, and she thought about the road back to Twin Pines, 14 miles west of Red Creek, in a county she had not known existed 6 months ago, and about the kitchen garden she'd planned for spring, and about the piano playing through the thin walls in the evenings, and about the 2 chairs on the porch. "Come on," she said to Grace, gently loosening her grip. "Let's go home." The road back from Wichita took 2 days, same as the road there, but it felt different in the body. The iron ruts were the same ruts, the cold the same cold, the horses working the same ground in the same November light. But something in the quality of the silence had changed. It had lost its held-breath quality, the particular tension of waiting for something to fall. Grace slept for most of the first day's travel, which was her way of processing large events. Lily sat in the wagon bed with a piece of paper on her knee and wrote musical notation in small, careful figures, her hands steady despite the jostling. Maggie rode up front again, and she was quieter than usual, which for Maggie meant she was thinking hard about something she wasn't ready to say yet. They stopped at the same way station outside Pratt. Fitch had headed back to Dodge directly from Wichita. He'd shaken Evelyn's hand outside the courthouse with the brisk satisfaction of a man who had done his job well and intended to move on to the next one, which she respected. Patterson had ridden his own horse and gone home. Dorothy Crane had pressed Evelyn's hand and said she was glad, and Evelyn had thanked her in a way she hoped conveyed more than the word could hold. And Mrs. Crane had said, "Come find me sometime when you're in Red Creek. I make a decent pie." And that was that. At the way station, while Caleb saw to the horses, Maggie finally said what she'd been thinking about. She cornered Evelyn at the wash basin, the two of them alone for a moment, and said without preamble, "What happens to the contract now?" Evelyn dried her hands. "What do you mean?" "The labor contract. Harlan dissolved the guardianship, but the contract still exists. We're still technically contracted to Mr. Mercer." She had the careful expression she wore when she was raising something she thought might be uncomfortable. "I want to know what the plan is." Evelyn looked at her daughter for a moment. 9 years old and asking about contract law at a way station in Pratt, Kansas, the day after a courthouse hearing. She thought about what Maggie's life was going to look like in 10 years, 20, and felt the particular complicated feeling of a mother who can see her child's future more clearly than the child can, and does not know how to prepare her for the size of it. "The plan," Evelyn said carefully, "is that we go home and we figure out what comes next when we get there." Maggie looked at her. "That's not a plan. That's a deferral." "Yes," Evelyn said, "sometimes a deferral is the right answer." Maggie considered this, filed it somewhere, and went to help with the horses. They reached Twin Pines Ranch in the late afternoon of the second day, when the light was going low and gold across the grassland, and the cold had that particular dry quality that meant the temperature would drop hard after dark. The ranch appeared first as the dark line of the cottonwood windbreak, then the barn roof, then the house itself, and Evelyn felt something in her chest loosen that she hadn't known was tight. Grace sat up from wherever she'd been drowsing in the wagon bed, looked at the house, and said, "Marshall's going to be upset we were gone." "Marshall has Webb to feed him," Lily said. "Webb doesn't talk to him," Grace said, as if this explained everything. "Marshall needs to be talked to." They found Marshall exactly where Grace had predicted, sitting on the porch step with the specific posture of a cat who has decided to make his displeasure visible. He looked at Grace when she climbed down from the wagon, and then he turned his head deliberately away, and Grace went to him immediately and sat beside him and spoke in the low private voice she used only for animals. And within 4 minutes he had forgiven her completely and was in her lap. Webb, the 17-year-old neighbor, a boy of almost aggressive silence, had kept the barn and the animals sound. He reported this to Caleb in approximately 6 words, accepted his pay with a nod, and left on his horse without ceremony. Lily watched him go from the porch with the same distant, polite look she always gave him. "He's strange," Lily said to no one in particular. "He's quiet," Evelyn said. "Same thing." Lily went inside. Caleb came up the porch steps after putting the horses in. He stopped beside Evelyn, who was standing at the top of the steps looking at the property in the last of the light. The barn, the corral, the fencing that still needed work in places, the kitchen garden plot now bare and frost-hardened for winter. He stood beside her without speaking for a moment. "I need to fix that south fence before the next cold snap," he said. "I know. And the east stall roof." "I know that too." He was quiet. The sun dropped below the line of the cottonwoods. "Glad to be back?" he asked. Evelyn thought about what Maggie had said at the way station. The contract. What comes next? All the things that were still unresolved, still unfinished, still carrying the particular weight of things that had not yet found their permanent shape. "Yes," she said. "I'm glad to be back." She meant it without reservation, which surprised her. December came in cold and gray and settled over the prairie like a lid. The work contracted in the way winter work does. Fewer hours of daylight, smaller range of movement, the ranch turning inward on itself. Caleb was up before dawn every morning for the animal feeding, and Evelyn was up shortly after to get the stove going, and the house filled with warmth and the smell of coffee and whatever she was baking. And the girls came down in stages in the way they always did. Maggie first and already organized, Lily next with her hair not yet pinned, Grace last with Marshall under her arm, as if she'd carried him down from the bed. It was an ordinary morning rhythm, the kind that accretes without intention, and it was theirs. Caleb noticed things in the way that people who spend a lot of time outdoors learn to notice. Quietly, without announcement, filling information away. He noticed that Maggie worked better in the morning and should be given the account work then, rather than in the evenings. He noticed that Lily needed 30 minutes of piano before she was fully present in the world, and began routing his own morning barn work so that it coincided with that window. which meant the piano didn't have to compete with anyone needing anything from Lily. He noticed that Grace's conversations with the animals were not random but structured. She was teaching herself what she needed to teach them, asking questions and then observing and then adjusting, systematic in the way that a small child can be when nobody has yet told them they need to approach things differently. He didn't announce any of these observations. He just adjusted around them. Evelyn saw him doing it. She didn't say anything about it for a while. Then one evening, she did. They were alone in the kitchen after supper, the girls upstairs, Lily's scales floating down through the floorboards. And Evelyn was mending, and Caleb was going over the winter cattle count, and she said, without looking up from the mending, "You've been routing the barn work around Lily's piano time." Caleb looked up from his ledger. "I noticed," she said. "She plays better when nobody needs her," he said, as if this were simply a logistical observation. "She does." Evelyn kept her eyes on the mending. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." He went back to the ledger. "Emma used to say I wasn't observant. She wasn't wrong, generally. I just observe different things than most people expect." Evelyn pulled a thread through. "What things?" He thought about this. "What people need when they're not asking for it," he said. "What the animals need before they start showing it. What the weather's going to do 2 days out." A pause. "Emma said it made me a good farmer and a mediocre conversationalist." "She wasn't wrong about that either," Evelyn said. He looked at her. She looked up at the same moment. They held it for a second, and then she went back to the mending with something that was not quite a smile, but was in that direction. And he made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. And that was the whole of it, and it was enough. The conversation about the contract happened in late December, 2 weeks before Christmas, on a day when a blizzard had them pinned indoors for the second day running, and the ranch was buried under 18 inches of new snow, and the wind was making the house work for its warmth. Caleb brought it up. Evelyn had been waiting for him to, in the way you wait for a conversation you know is coming. Not with dread exactly, but with the awareness that something needs to be addressed, and the slight discomfort of not yet knowing what you're going to say. He came in from the barn at midday, stamped the snow from his boots, took his coat off, and poured coffee, and then he sat down at the kitchen table and said, "I want to talk about the contract." Maggie, who was at the other end of the table, immediately stood up. "I'll go upstairs." "Sit down, Maggie," Evelyn said. Maggie sat down. She folded her hands on the table and looked attentive. Caleb looked at her for a moment, then at Evelyn. He wrapped both hands around his cup. "The labor contract runs through next August," he said. "That's when it expires under the terms Blaine set up." He paused. "I want to dissolve it now." Evelyn looked at him. "Dissolve it?" "Cancel it. Draw up a new arrangement. Something—" He stopped and looked at his coffee. "Something that doesn't have the word labor in it. Something that reflects what's actually happening here rather than what Blaine set up to happen." "What is actually happening here?" Evelyn asked. She kept her voice level, but the question was real. He looked up at her. "You run the house. You manage the accounts. Maggie manages the accounts. You oversee them. You've taken over every domestic decision on this property and made most of them better than I would have made them. You've got a kitchen garden planned for spring that's going to produce more than the household needs, which means a surplus I can sell." He looked at his hands. "You're not a laborer. You're a partner." A pause. "I'd like to make that official, if you're willing." The kitchen was very quiet except for the wind and the stove. "A partner," Evelyn said. "Equal share in the ranch income. Your name on the property decisions. Your say in what we do here and how." He looked at her directly. "It's your home too. I'd like the paperwork to say what it is." Maggie was being very still in the way she was still when she was working hard not to react. Evelyn said, "This is not a small thing you're offering." "I know what I'm offering." "Caleb." She waited until he met her eyes. "Do you understand what it means for me to put my name on something again? I signed papers I didn't understand and lost everything. I'm careful with my name now." "I know that." He held her gaze. "I'm not asking you to sign anything you don't fully understand. We get Fitch to draw it up, and you read every word, and you ask every question you need to ask before you decide." He paused. "I'm just asking if you're willing to consider it." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Thomas and the farm and the papers in the lawyer's office. She thought about the boarding house, and the auction block, and the courthouse in Wichita, and the hammer coming down. She thought about the kitchen garden, and the 2 chairs on the porch, and Lily's unnamed piece playing through the walls. "I'll consider it," she said. Maggie exhaled very quietly through her nose. "Maggie," Evelyn said. "I didn't say anything," Maggie said. She wrote to Fitch in January. He wrote back with a proposed partnership agreement that was 8 pages and written in the dense prose of a man who made his living from precision. She read every word, as promised. She made notes in the margins. She wrote back with 4 questions, 2 of which Fitch said were excellent points and led to revisions. The process took 3 weeks. Caleb did not rush her. He asked once if she had what she needed and accepted her yes and did not ask again. She signed it on the 1st of February, at the kitchen table, with Maggie and Lily and Grace all present because they were part of what was being decided and she wanted them to see it done. Caleb signed it across from her. Fitch had sent 2 copies. They each kept 1. Maggie watched the whole thing with the expression she wore when she was memorizing something. Afterward, Grace said, "Does this mean we're staying?" "Yes," Evelyn said. "Forever?" Evelyn looked at Caleb. He was folding his copy of the agreement with the careful economy he brought to things that mattered to him. "I expect so," she said. Grace nodded, satisfied, and went back to Marshall, who had been waiting on the floor with the patience of a cat who knows that humans will eventually stop doing whatever they're doing and pay attention to more important things. What changed after the signing was not dramatic. The days were the same days. The work was the same work. But there was something different in the quality of the decisions that got made, a straightforwardness to them, a mutuality that had been present in practice but was now present in fact as well. Evelyn ordered seeds for the spring garden in her own name, from her own account. She had her own account now, at the bank in Dodge, something she hadn't had since before Thomas died. The order was larger than any she'd made before, calculated around what the household needed and what surplus would sell, and at what margin. She'd gone through the numbers with Maggie, and Maggie had found 1 error and 2 improvements, and the final order was better than what Evelyn had started with. Caleb bought a second milk cow in March, and he asked Evelyn first rather than telling her after. This was new. She noted it and said nothing about it, just gave her opinion on the purchase, which was that it was a good cow at a fair price, and yes. The thing between them, the thing that had been unnamed and carefully sidestepped for months, did not resolve itself into anything tidy because there was no tidy resolution available to 2 people who had both been through enough to make them careful. But it moved. In the way that things move when people stop trying to prevent the movement. He sat with her on the porch in the evenings sometimes, when the work was done and the girls were inside, the 2 rocking chairs. She had thought, in August, that those chairs belonged to who the house used to be. She thought now that they belonged to who the house was becoming, and the difference seemed significant. They talked about the ranch mostly, what needed doing, what was planned, what problems were developing before they became actual problems. They talked about the girls, Maggie's arithmetic, Lily's music, Grace's slow and serious education in veterinary improvisation, which was what Caleb called her work with the animals when he was trying not to sound impressed. They talked about other things sometimes, not often, and not at length, because neither of them was built for length when it came to things that mattered. But sometimes. One evening in late March, when the weather had broken and the prairie was doing the tentative green thing it did in early spring, Caleb said, "Emma would have liked you." Evelyn rocked. "You said that once before, about the girls." "About the girls, yeah, but I mean you too." He looked out at the darkening grass. "She would have said you were too stubborn and been right and liked you anyway." A pause. "She liked people who were difficult, said it meant they were paying attention." Evelyn considered this. "Thomas would have liked you," she said after a moment. "He didn't have much patience for men who talked around things. He would have appreciated the directness." "Was he a good man?" Caleb asked. He asked it the way he asked most things, plainly, without particular delicacy, just the question itself. Evelyn thought about it properly. Not the reflex answer, but the real one. "He was a good man who made bad choices out of pride and didn't tell me things I needed to know. Those 2 things were both true at the same time." She paused. "I spent a long time being angry about the second thing and not enough time being fair about the first." Another pause. I'm working on that. Caleb nodded. Not agreement, exactly, but recognition. I wasn't always easy to live with, he said. Emma's word was remote. I'd go somewhere inside myself and close the door, and she'd be outside knocking, and I'd know she was there and not open it. He drank his coffee. I didn't know how to explain why. Still don't, completely. He looked at Evelyn sidelong. I'm trying not to do that as much. She looked at him. I've noticed. Is it working? She thought about it. More than it used to. He nodded, something in him settling. It wasn't a declaration of anything. It was just two people talking honestly, in rocking chairs, in the dark. The spring planting went better than anything Evelyn had managed on the old farm, which wasn't vanity. It was the result of better soil, more water access, and Maggie's production schedule, which was a document that Maggie had produced over the course of February and March, and which was the most organized thing Evelyn had seen in her adult life. Grace got into a conflict with a neighboring rancher's dog in April when she found it worrying one of the young calves and chased it off the property with a fence post and a vocabulary that Evelyn had not known Grace possessed. Caleb heard about this from the neighboring rancher, who came over to apologize for the dog, and ended up telling the story with a quality in his voice that wasn't entirely censure. Grace, when confronted, was unapologetic. The dog was hurting the calf, she said. You don't know what language you used, Evelyn said. I know exactly what language I used. Grace looked at her with those wide, dark eyes. It worked. Grace. I won't do it in the house, Grace said, but outside with the animals. I'll do what the situation requires. Evelyn looked at Caleb, who was looking at the ceiling with the expression of a man who is working very hard not to react in a way that would undermine the parenting. We'll discuss this later, Evelyn said. They discussed it later. It did not go entirely Evelyn's way, which was how things sometimes went with Grace. The thing Evelyn had not anticipated, the thing that snuck up on her in the way that things which happen gradually always sneak up on you, was how much she had come to need Caleb, not in a dependent way. She was careful about that, alert to the distinction, because she had been dependent before, and it had cost her. But in the way that you need a person whose judgment you trust and whose presence doesn't require explanation. In the way that you need someone who will say the difficult thing when you're avoiding it and not say anything when silence is right. She was checking the seed inventory in the barn one afternoon in April, going through the remaining stock to see what the kitchen garden still needed, when Caleb came in from the south field and stopped at the barn door and said, I need to tell you something. Something in his voice made her set down the seed bag. He was dusty from the field, and his expression had the particular quality of a man who has been working himself up to something all day. I got a letter in town yesterday, he said, from my brother in Colorado. I didn't know you had a brother. We've been on bad terms for a long time. He came further into the barn. Roy, who had been sleeping in the hay, raised his head and then put it down. He had a ranch outside Denver that went under last year. He's asking if I have room for him, his wife and 2 boys. He looked at Evelyn. I wanted to tell you before I responded. She looked at him. This is your ranch, your brother. It's our ranch, he said. Straightforward, no emphasis, just the fact. She absorbed this. Do you want him here? I don't know. He leaned against the stall post. We fell out over how our mother's estate was handled 15 years ago. Nothing was said that was... He stopped. We both said things. I said things that were harder to unsay than I expected. He looked at the barn floor. He's my brother. His kids don't have anywhere. Evelyn thought about it. What's his wife like? I don't know. I've never met her. They married after the falling out. Write back and ask if they can come for a month first, she said. See how it works before anyone makes a permanent decision. He looked at her. A month is long enough to know if it's possible, she said, and short enough that everyone can withdraw without it being a catastrophe. She went back to the seed stock. What are the boys' ages? The letter says 9 and 11, she calculated. Maggie will organize them within a week, she said, whether they want to be organized or not. The thing that wasn't quite a laugh moved across his face again. He pushed off the stall post. I'll write tonight. Good. She made a note on the inventory. Caleb. He stopped at the barn door. The fact that you asked me, she said without looking up. I know you didn't have to. I appreciate it. He was quiet for a moment. I know, he said. That's why I did. He went back to the field. Evelyn kept the inventory. Outside, the spring light came through the barn boards in long, dusty lines, and one of the mares moved in her stall, and somewhere across the yard she could hear Lily playing the piano through the open house window. The unnamed piece, cleaner and more complete than it had been in November. Caleb's brother arrived in May. His name was Daniel, and the first thing Evelyn noticed about him was that he had Caleb's eyes and a face that was otherwise entirely different, more open, more mobile, the face of a man who led with himself rather than held back. He was 40, thin from a hard year, with hands that looked like they'd worked but also looked like they might be more comfortable elsewhere. His wife, whose name was Clara, was a compact red-haired woman with freckles and the kind of efficient assessment of a new place that Evelyn recognized as belonging to women who had moved more than they wanted to and had gotten very quick at figuring out what mattered. Their boys were named Robert and James, 11 and 9. Robert had Daniel's open face, and James had something else entirely. He was quiet and watchful in a way that reminded Evelyn faintly of Caleb. The first week was uncomfortable in the particular way that weeks are uncomfortable when two families are learning each other's shapes. Daniel and Caleb had 15 years of unspoken things between them, and those things manifested as an excess of politeness that was more strained than open hostility would have been. They were careful with each other in the way of men who are not sure where the landmines are. Clara was easier. She found Evelyn in the kitchen on the second morning and said without preamble, "Tell me what needs doing and I'll do it," which was the right thing to say. "Can you preserve?" Evelyn asked. "I can do anything with a jar and a hot stove," Clara said. "Good." Evelyn handed her an apron. "The tomatoes are coming in 2 weeks, and I need help." They worked well together, which was a relief. Two women in a kitchen can be easy or difficult, depending on whether they need to be right or whether they need to get the work done. And Clara needed to get the work done, and so did Evelyn, and that was a solid basis for something. The boys were another matter. Robert spent the first 3 days following Maggie around with the look of a boy who has encountered something he doesn't have a category for. Maggie, who was 10 now, treated him with the brisk neutrality she applied to anyone who hadn't yet proven themselves useful. James gravitated to Grace and the animals with almost no friction at all. By the third day, he was helping her with the morning barn rounds, and Grace had pronounced him tolerable, which from Grace was a significant endorsement. Caleb and Daniel's reconciliation, such as it was, happened in the barn on the fourth evening, and Evelyn only knew about it because Caleb told her. She was on the porch when he came back from a long time in the barn, and he sat in his chair and was quiet for a while. "We talked," he said. "I figured. It's not—" He stopped. 15 years is a long time. You can't undo 15 years in one night in a barn. He looked at the dark. But we said things. The things that needed saying. How did it go? He considered. Better than I expected. Worse than I hoped. He paused. About right for two people who waited too long. Evelyn nodded. That's usually how it goes. He looked at her. Sounds like you know something about it. She looked out at this dark prairie. I have a sister in Ohio I haven't written to in 4 years, she said. We said things after my parents died, about the estate, about who got what. She paused. Things that seemed too important to forgive at the time. What changed? She was quiet for a moment. I stood on an auction block with my daughters, she said, and I thought about who I would want to know about it. She was on the list. She looked at Caleb. I wrote to her in March. She hasn't written back yet. Caleb absorbed this. Give her time. I'm giving her time. She pulled her shawl around her. We're both stubborn. It runs in the family. Something crossed his face. Not amusement exactly, but something warmer, something that had been moving toward warmth for months. He looked at her the way he'd been looking at her more lately, directly and without the careful margin he'd used to maintain. Evelyn, he said. She knew what was coming. She'd known it was coming for a while, in the way you know things that are moving slowly toward you across open ground. You don't have to, she started. I know I don't have to, he said. We've established that I'm generally aware of what I'm required to do and what I'm choosing to do. His voice was level, but not quite as flat as usual. There was something in it that she'd learned to hear over the months, the slight difference in him when he was saying something that cost him something. I'm choosing to tell you that I love you, not as a piece of information I'm presenting for your consideration, just as a fact. I've known it for a while, and I'm tired of not saying it. The porch was very quiet. Across the yard, a horse moved in the barn. Caleb, she said. I'm not asking anything, he said. I'm not pushing for anything. I know there's things you're still working through. I'm just done pretending I don't feel what I feel, because I'm not good at that particular kind of pretending, and it takes a lot of energy that I'd rather spend on something else. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Thomas, who had kept things from her. She thought about Hector Blaine, who had used her trust against her. She thought about the years she'd spent in marriages and circumstances where the shape of things was decided without her, and the long, slow work of this past year of relearning what it felt like to be a person whose voice counted. She thought about the man in the canvas coat at the back of a crowd in Red Creek, who had bought a woman and her daughters not because it profited him, but because a child had grabbed her sister's hand. I know you're not, she said. You're the least pretending person I've ever met. She looked at the dark. I love you too, she said. I've known it for a while. I've been making sure I was saying it for the right reasons, and not because I was frightened or grateful or because it was convenient. She paused. I'm saying it now because it's true. He said nothing for a moment. All right, he said. She looked at him. All right? I'm not... He stopped. I don't know how to do this part. The talking about it. Emma used to say I treated love like a piece of farm equipment, like if I got the mechanics right, the thing would just run. He looked at his hands. I'm aware that's a problem. It is, she said. We'll work on it. You're willing to work on it. I've worked on harder things. He looked at her. She looked at him. The dark prairie went on in all directions, and the house behind them was full of their family. All of it their family now, the impossible accumulated fact of it. And the two chairs on the porch held them both, and nothing was simple or resolved, and it was still, despite everything, the best thing. They married in June, at the ranch, with no ceremony beyond what was required by the county clerk, who rode out from Red Creek to make it official. Evelyn had not wanted a celebration, not because she wasn't glad, but because she'd done the large ceremony the first time, and the large ceremony had not turned out to be the part that mattered. What mattered was the morning after, when she came downstairs and the kitchen was already warm because Caleb had gotten the stove going on his way to the barn, and Grace was in the chair by the window with Marshall in her lap, and Lily was at the piano running her scales, and Maggie was at the table with the accounts, looking up long enough to say good morning, and then looking back down. And the light came through the east window at the angle it always came through in June mornings at this latitude. And Evelyn stood in the doorway of her kitchen and looked at all of it. Daniel and Clara were in the guest room down the hall. They had decided to stay, which had required negotiation and a second meeting with Fitch about the property arrangements, and two very frank conversations about what staying would and would not mean. Robert and James were somewhere in the barn with Grace, and James's burgeoning and increasingly systematic interest in the animals had led to a partnership with Grace that nobody had seen coming and that was producing, among other things, detailed hand-drawn charts of each animal's medical history, which Grace kept in a box under her bed with the organization of someone who has found her life's work and intends to be ready for it. Caleb came in from the barn and stopped beside her in the doorway. He looked at the kitchen the same way she was looking at it. Coffee's ready, he said. I know. I was up early. I know that too. She looked at him. He had hay on his sleeve and his hair was doing the thing it did in the mornings before he'd had time to settle it. Thank you, she said. For the stove. He looked at her sideways. It's my stove too. Ours, she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he went to get his coffee, and she got hers, and the kitchen filled with the sounds of the morning. Lily's scales, Marshall's periodic commentary, the outdoor sounds of a ranch coming alive in June. And Evelyn drank her coffee standing up because there was work to do, and always would be. And the work was theirs, and the day was theirs, and none of it was perfect, and all of it was real. The letter from Evelyn's sister arrived in August, 14 months after Evelyn had sent hers. It was not a long letter. Ruth had never been a woman of many words on paper. She was a woman of many words in person, loud and fast and prone to interrupting, which had been the source of half their childhood arguments and probably some of the adult ones too. The letter was 2 pages in Ruth's cramped handwriting, and it said, in its essential substance, "I got your letter. I've read it more than once. I don't know how to respond to what happened to you because I don't have words that are big enough, and I'm not going to pretend I do. I'm sorry I didn't write sooner. I'm stubborn, and you know it, and I'm sorry anyway. Tell me about your girls." Evelyn read it at this kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in August, the anniversary month of the auction, though she hadn't tracked the specific date, and she sat with it for a while before she folded it and put it in her apron pocket. She wrote back that same evening. 4 pages. The longest letter she'd written in years. Caleb saw her writing it and said nothing, just set a fresh cup of coffee beside her elbow and went to bed. And she thought, not for the first time, that his particular form of attention, the kind that gave you what you needed without asking you to account for needing it, was rarer than people understood. She finished the letter and sealed it and set it by the door to mail in the morning, and she sat for a moment in the quiet kitchen, and she thought about Ruth, how they'd grown up in the same house and turned out so differently, and how that had seemed, when they were young, like a problem to be resolved, and how she understood now that it wasn't a problem at all. It was just 2 people. She was 43 years old. No, 32. She'd lost track for a moment, which told her it had been a long year. And she was sitting in her own kitchen, in her own house, with her husband asleep upstairs, and her daughters in their rooms, and the prairie dark and quiet outside. And the letter to her sister was sealed on the table, and none of the damage of the past 2 years was undone. But she was still here and still whole, and that counted for something. That counted for quite a lot. Ta-ta-tam. The campaign, as Maggie would later call it, did not begin as a campaign. It began as a letter. Evelyn had been thinking about Harlan's comment since November. His statement that he found the practices described in testimony troubling and that he intended to make his findings part of the record. She had thought about what a judge saying a thing found it troubling and added it to the record actually produced in the world, which in her experience was not much. Records were records. Troubling was troubling. Neither of those things changed the law. The law was what changed things. And the law had not changed. She wrote to Harlan first, in December, asking whether his finding had been forwarded to the relevant oversight body and what the oversight body had done with it. Harlan wrote back in January. She had not expected him to write back at all, and his doing so told her something, saying that the finding had been submitted, that it had been acknowledged, and that to his knowledge no action had been taken. She wrote to the oversight body. The oversight body wrote back with the kind of letter that is designed to sound responsive while committing to nothing. She read it 3 times and identified exactly where the language became non-committal and what that non-committal language was protecting. Then she wrote back with specific questions about specific statutes. Maggie had been watching this correspondence develop over the winter with the intense attention she brought to things she recognized as significant. One evening in February, she sat across from Evelyn at the kitchen table and said, "You need more than letters." "I know," Evelyn said. "You need other women, other families." Maggie had a pencil in her hand. She always had a pencil. The oversight body isn't going to respond to one person's letters. They'll respond to volume, to documented cases, to the visibility of the problem. She tapped the pencil on the table. "Mrs. Crane knows people in Red Creek. Dorothy Crane's husband is on the county board, and Claire's been here a year. She knows women in Dodge whose situations are similar to yours." Evelyn looked at her daughter, 11 years old with her father's straight brown hair and Evelyn's gray-green eyes and something entirely her own behind them, something that had been there since she was small and had only gotten cleaner and clearer with time. "When did you work all this out?" Evelyn asked. "I've been working on it since the courthouse," Maggie said. "I just wanted to see if you were going to get there yourself first." She set the pencil down. "You were taking too long." Dorothy Crane was, as it turned out, exactly the person Evelyn needed. She came to Twin Pines in March with 2 women from Red Creek she'd recruited herself. A widow named Helen Marsh, who had been through a version of the Guardian system 5 years earlier and had a story that made Evelyn's stomach tighten, and a younger woman named Frances Webb, no relation to the taciturn neighbor boy, who was currently in the early stages of the guardianship process with a relative she didn't trust. and who had come, she said, because she wanted to understand what she was in the middle of before it was too late to do anything about it. They sat at Evelyn's kitchen table with coffee and the windows letting in the thin March light, and talked for 3 hours. Clara came in halfway through and sat down without being invited, which was Clara's way, and proved to be useful. She had grown up in Missouri and knew a woman in the state capitol there who had been working on similar issues through a different legal angle, and she thought the approaches might have something to learn from each other. By the end of 3 hours, they had a list of names, a list of documented cases between them, a draft letter to the state assembly that Maggie had written in real time at the end of the table while the conversation was happening, and a plan for who would write to whom. Frances Webb looked at the draft letter and said, "She wrote this? She's 11. Almost 12, Maggie said, not looking up from the correction she was making to it. Helen Marsh looked at Evelyn. "Your daughter is going to do something," she said. She said it with the weight of recognition, the way older people sometimes say things about younger ones when they see something that reminds them of what the world could do with the right person in the right place. "I know," Evelyn said. The response from the state assembly took 4 months and was not encouraging, which was what Evelyn had expected. Political bodies do not move because someone writes them a well-reasoned letter. They move because the cost of not moving eventually exceeds the cost of moving, and getting to that point requires time and noise and the specific persistence of people who will not accept a form letter as an answer. Evelyn accepted nothing as an answer. She wrote again. Dorothy Crane wrote. Helen Marsh wrote from her particular experience, which had the kind of specific documented detail that was harder to dismiss than general principle. Clara wrote to her contact in Missouri, and Clara's contact wrote to people in Kansas she knew, which produced 3 additional letters to the assembly from outside sources, which was a form of volume. Caleb watched all of this from a comfortable distance that was not indifference but respect. He had said early on, when Evelyn had first described what she was trying to do, that he was not a man of letters and political maneuvering, and that he would do whatever was useful, but she should tell him what that was, rather than assuming he'd figure it out. She had told him, be a credible name on a petition, show up when presence was needed, and keep the ranch running while she spent hours at the kitchen table writing correspondence instead. He did all 3 without complaint. "Does it bother you?" she asked him once, in the spring. She was at the table with the correspondence spread out before her, and supper was late because she'd lost track of time, which happened more often now. "What?" "That this takes time. That it takes my time." He thought about it, which she appreciated. He didn't give reflexive answers. "No," he said. "It needs doing. You're the one to do it." He got up and started supper himself, which he did with the resigned competence of a man who has accepted that his cooking will never be more than functional. "Does it bother you that it takes this long?" She looked at the letters. "Yes," she said. "Every day I know there are families in the same position we were in a year ago, and every day I'm writing letters instead of doing something that feels like it actually matters." "The letters are doing something," he said. He said it without reassurance tune, just as a statement of his assessment. "You just can't see it yet." She went back to the letters. Yumped. The thing that shifted, the thing that turned correspondence into something larger, was Hector Blaine. He had been quiet since the Wichita ruling. Evelyn had not forgotten him. You don't forget a person who sold you on an auction block, regardless of what happens afterward. But she had not heard his name in months and had cautiously allowed herself to stop tracking his movements with the specific alertness she'd maintained through the winter. In May, a letter came from Fitch. Blaine had filed a similar guardianship action in a neighboring county. A young widow with 2 children, debts on a failed claim, a relative unable to take them in. The circumstances were nearly identical to Evelyn's. The auction was scheduled for July. Evelyn read the letter standing at the door where the mail had arrived. She read it once, then again. Then she folded it and went inside and sat at the table and was very still for a few minutes. Caleb came in and saw her face and said, "What happened?" She told him. He sat down across from her. He didn't say anything right away, which was the right response. "What's her name?" he asked. Evelyn looked at the letter. "Margaret Holt, 28. Her daughters are 5 and 7. Caleb was quiet. "He's going to keep doing it," Evelyn said. "The ruling didn't stop him because the ruling only applied to us. The law still permits it. He just finds a new county, a new situation, and starts again. She looked at Caleb. Harlan's finding is in the record, and it doesn't matter because the record is a piece of paper in a courthouse in Wichita, and Margaret Holt is in a boarding house somewhere with her daughters, and she doesn't know what's coming. What do you want to do? Caleb asked. She had been asking herself that since she'd read the letter. She knew the answer. She'd known it since Wichita, probably. Since before Wichita. I want to go to her, she said. I want to find her and tell her what I know and help her build a case. And I want to do what we should have done 6 months ago. I want to take this to someone who can actually move the law, not just write letters to people who file them. Who's that? There's an assembly member in Topeka named Garrett. Clara's contact mentioned him. He's been trying to reform the guardianship statutes for 2 years, and he can't get traction because he doesn't have documented cases, just the general principle. She looked at Caleb. We have documented cases. We have Helen Marsh and Frances Webb and Dorothy Crane, and now Margaret Holt, if she's willing, and Harlan's finding and Fitch's records and 2 years of correspondence that shows the oversight body won't act. She paused. That's not a letter. That's a file. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then build the file, he said. Well, she went to Margaret Holt in June with Dorothy Crane beside her and a letter from Fitch in her bag explaining the legal situation in plain language. She had written to Margaret first, and Margaret had written back in 3 days, which told Evelyn everything she needed to know about Margaret's state of mind. Margaret was 28 and looked younger, a small woman with dark circles under her eyes, and 2 daughters who watched strangers from behind her skirt in the way that children do when they have learned that strangers bring news that changes things. Her name was the same as Maggie's full name, which Evelyn noted and said nothing about. They sat in a boarding house room that was 2 rooms and 1 window, and Evelyn recognized the precise dimensions of what she was looking at, and she looked at it steadily and did not look away. She told Margaret everything, not the polished version, not the version that made her look composed and competent throughout. The actual version, the terror on the platform, the way Maggie's face had gone blank, the nights she hadn't slept, the way she had failed to understand what she was signing and what it cost her. She told it all of it because the polished version would not have been useful to Margaret, and the truth was the only tool she had to offer. Margaret listened without interrupting, which took effort. Evelyn could see the effort, the held questions, the moments where Margaret's expression told her she recognized something and wanted to say so, but was making herself wait. When Evelyn finished, Margaret said, "How did you fight it?" "I gathered everything I could," Evelyn said. "Documentation, witnesses, my own testimony. And someone helped me." "Who?" "My husband. Before he was my husband." She paused. "A man who was willing to put himself between us and the system." Margaret looked at her hands. "I don't have anyone like that." "You have me," Evelyn said. "And Mrs. Crane?" "And Fitch, who will take your case because I've asked him to, and because the documented pattern of Blaine's behavior is now strong enough that it's in Fitch's professional interest to be on record against it." She leaned forward. "You're not alone in this, Margaret. That's what I came to tell you." Margaret looked at her. Her eyes were wet, which she seemed to consider a weakness and was visibly frustrated about. "Why are you doing this?" Evelyn thought about how to answer that, and then thought that the honest answer was probably better than any other kind. "Because I stood on an auction block with my daughters," she said, "and a stranger looked at what was happening and decided it was his business. And because when it was over, I thought about all the women standing on platforms where no one looks." She paused. "I'm not a man with money and a wagon, but I have this." Dorothy Crane, who had been sitting quietly by the window, said, "Also, she writes a terrifying letter. I've seen the correspondence." Margaret laughed. A short, surprised sound, the kind that comes out when you haven't expected to find anything funny. "What?" Margaret's case did not go as smoothly as Evelyn's had. Nothing about it was smooth. Blaine had learned from Wichita, and his lawyer had learned from Wichita, and the first hearing in the neighboring county did not go in Margaret's favor, which sent Fitch back to research and Evelyn back to her correspondence with a fury she had to consciously moderate into something that could be put in writing without reading as hysterical, which was how women's anger was dismissed by official bodies, and which she refused to give them the opportunity to do. The appeal took 3 months. Fitch argued it well. Margaret was a composed and specific witness who had been carefully prepared and who had Evelyn's documentation of Blaine's pattern of behavior to support her. The appeal judge was not Harlan. He was a younger man named Fowler, who was less experienced but, as it turned out, more troubled by what he was looking at. He ruled in Margaret's favor in October. His ruling included language that Harlan's had not, that the pattern of conduct described across multiple cases suggested a systematic misuse of the guardianship mechanism that warranted legislative attention. Fitch sent Evelyn the ruling with a note in the margin. This is the language you needed. Evelyn sent the ruling to Assemblymember Garrett in Topeka with a cover letter that took her 4 drafts and that she read to Caleb before she sent it, not for approval but because she had found that reading things aloud to him helped her hear what was wrong with them. "Third paragraph," he said when she finished. She looked at it. "Too much." "Too much," he agreed. She cut the 3rd paragraph entirely, and the letter was better for it. Garrett responded in 2 weeks, which was faster than anything she'd received from an elected official in 2 years. He wanted to meet. He was building a reform bill, and he had been building it on principle and general argument, and what Evelyn had sent him was something different. Documented cases, patterns, specific statutory language, and how it had been exploited. A judge's ruling that named the problem in legal terms. He came to Topeka. She came to Topeka. Caleb came with her. Not because she needed him to, but because he wanted to see it, and she was glad of him beside her. Garrett was younger than she'd expected, mid-40s, with a harried manner, and the particular tiredness of a man who has been trying to do a difficult thing for a long time without adequate support. He shook her hand and said, "I've read everything you sent, twice." He sat down. "Tell me the rest." She told him the rest. For 2 hours across a desk in his Topeka office, she laid out what she had built. The cases, the documentation, the pattern of exploitation, the gaps in the current statute that made the exploitation not only possible but easy. She told it plainly, the way Mrs. Croft had told her to testify, without performance, without making herself the center of it, just the facts arranged in the order that made their meaning clear. Garrett took notes. He asked questions that were precise and often uncomfortable, the questions of a man who was looking for weaknesses in the argument so he could address them before someone else did. When she finished, he sat back and looked at his notes. "What you're describing would require amending 3 separate statutes," he said. "I know. I had Fitch identify them. Fitch. The opposition will come from the people who benefit from the current system, placement agents, certain county officials." He looked at her. "And people who will argue that guardianship reform weakens the state's ability to protect vulnerable families." "I know that argument," Evelyn said. "I'd like to suggest that a system that allows vulnerable families to be auctioned is not meaningfully protecting them." Something moved across Garrett's face. "No," he said. "It's not." He closed his notebook. "I want to use your case as the primary documentary example in the bill. Your case and Mrs. Holt's, with your permission." "Yes," Evelyn said, without hesitation. Garrett nodded. "Then let's talk about what this bill needs to say." The bill took 18 months to pass. That is not a short time, and it did not feel short while it was happening. There were hearings and revisions and a committee that watered down 2 provisions and a floor debate that went poorly the first time and had to be rebuilt. And through all of it, Evelyn wrote letters and traveled to Topeka twice more and testified before the committee in a room full of men in good suits and said what she had to say with the same directness she'd brought to Harlan's courtroom. Hector Blaine did not testify. His lawyer filed a brief opposing the reform. The brief was technically competent and substantively indefensible, and Fitch addressed it in 12 pages that Maggie, who was 13 by then and had appointed herself the family's informal legal researcher, described as efficient and thorough, which was the highest praise Maggie gave to anything. Blaine himself had continued operating through the year of the bill's debate. There had been 2 more documented cases in counties across the state. Both families had been connected through the network that Evelyn and Dorothy Crane and Helen Marsh had been quietly building, to lawyers who knew what they were dealing with and how to fight it. Neither case went to auction. Small victories. Not the thing itself, but proof the thing was possible. The bill passed on a Thursday in March, 2 years and 7 months after the auction in Red Creek. Garrett sent a telegram to Twin Pines Ranch that arrived before the official news did, addressed to Evelyn Mercer, and it said, "It passed. Your name is in the record." Caleb read it over her shoulder and said nothing, just put his hand on her shoulder for a moment and left it there. The years after that were not free of difficulty, because no years are. Daniel and Clara's arrangement with the ranch had its complications. Daniel and Caleb found their equilibrium slowly and imperfectly, with setbacks, with at least one argument that lasted 3 weeks and required Evelyn and Clara to essentially manage the ranch between them while their husbands were in their respective silences. But they found it. Most things that matter are found slowly and imperfectly, and that is not a flaw in the finding. The law that passed was not perfect. 2 of the provisions Garrett had originally written were weakened in committee and never fully restored. The enforcement mechanism was inadequate for the first 4 years and required additional legislation to strengthen. Evelyn wrote letters about this too. She had become, by this point, a person who wrote letters the way other people breathed, as a matter of biological necessity, as the basic mechanism by which she processed the world and acted on it. She started corresponding with women in other states where similar systems operated. Missouri, where Clara's contact had been working. Nebraska, Colorado. The network grew in the way that networks grow when the need is real and the people are determined, slowly, unevenly, with gaps and with nodes where someone particularly capable had decided this was their work. She was not, as she was careful to say to anyone who described her as such, a crusader. She did not experience herself as crusading. She experienced herself as a woman who had understood something about how the world worked and had decided to make herself useful to that understanding. The distinction mattered to her, even if it didn't matter to anyone else. Maggie would have said the distinction was semantic. Maggie said a lot of things, increasingly, with the authority of a person who was right more often than was strictly comfortable for the people around her. Maggie went to the agricultural college in Manhattan, Kansas, at 16, 2 years early, on the basis of an entrance examination that the admissions committee had apparently discussed for some time before concluding there was no grounds to refuse her. She studied economics and agricultural science and wrote home every week, letters that were informative, occasionally wry, and almost never sentimental. She came home for Christmas and summers and drove everyone slightly mad with the energy of a person who has found the place where their mind fits. She was 23 when she published her first paper on frontier land economics, and it was reviewed in an agricultural journal in Chicago as unusually precise, which Evelyn read aloud to Caleb, who said, "Is that good?" And Evelyn said, "For Maggie, it's everything." Lily's music took a different path, less linear, less institutional. She had a year in Kansas City at 19 that Evelyn worried about, and Lily did not find worry useful, and then 2 years in Chicago, and then she came back west. Not to Twin Pines, though she visited often, but to a town in Colorado where she taught music and composed, and where the unnamed piece she had started writing in a boarding house in Wichita eventually became the first movement of something larger. Evelyn heard the full version for the first time when Lily was 26, at a small performance in a Denver hall. She sat beside Caleb in the 4th row and listened to her daughter's music fill a room full of strangers, and she thought about a girl of 8 who had stood in a doorway with her hand on the frame, listening to what a piano would sound like. She did not cry during the performance. She cried briefly in the carriage afterward, with the specific suppressed efficiency of a woman who has permitted herself exactly as much feeling as the moment requires, and not one particle more, and Caleb saw it and said nothing, which was exactly right. Grace's path was the one that surprised people who hadn't been watching closely, which was anyone who hadn't lived with her. She apprenticed with a veterinarian in Dodge at 15, which required a letter from Caleb and another from the veterinarian who had been called to Twin Pines twice for emergencies and had been visibly astonished by what he found Grace already doing. She studied in Missouri for 3 years. She came back to Kansas and set up a practice in a town east of Dodge, and she had clients who drove 2 hours to see her with their animals. Not because there was no one closer, but because Grace was the one who understood what was actually wrong. She never officially named the barn cat. She had other cats by then, working cats on the property she eventually bought, but when people asked about Marshall, and she told the story sometimes about the old torn-eared cat who had come to her on the 3rd day because she was careful and she showed up, she said he had a name that she'd told him when she was 7 and that she considered it between the two of them. Awesome. Evelyn stood before a legislative committee in Topeka in the autumn of 1901, 14 years after the auction in Red Creek, to testify in support of a strengthening amendment to the statute that had been passed in 1889. She was 45 years old. She had silver in her hair, and the lines in her face had settled into something that people sometimes called distinguished when they were being kind, and she called earned when she was being precise. She told the story. She had told it many times now, in many rooms, to many people with varying degrees of power to do something about it. She had learned over the years which parts landed and which parts people flinched from and which parts made them look at their hands. She told it anyway. All of it, every time. Because stories that get cleaned up lose their truth, and the truth was the only thing she'd ever had that couldn't be taken from her. Afterward, a young man on the committee staff stopped her in the hallway. He was 20-something with an earnest face and a notebook and the manner of someone who is not sure they have the right to speak to the person they're speaking to. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "I wanted to tell you, my mother was in a guardianship arrangement when I was small, before the statutes changed." He looked at his notebook. She got out because of the reforms, because there was legal mechanism available to her that hadn't existed before. He stopped. "I just wanted to say that." Evelyn looked at him for a moment. He had dark circles under his eyes, and the specific tiredness of someone who works long hours for the causes they believe in and doesn't have enough money and does it anyway. "What's your name?" she asked. "William," he said. "William Holt." She looked at him. "Your mother?" "Margaret," he said. "Margaret Holt. She remarried. She's in Iowa now." He paused. "She talks about you sometimes. She said you came to her in a boarding house when she didn't know what was coming." He met her eyes. "She said you told her she wasn't alone." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "How is she?" she asked. "She's good," he said. "She's all right." He said it with the quality of a son who means it, not as reassurance but as fact. "She's all right." Dumb. She went home to Twin Pines on the evening train, and Caleb met her at the station in Dodge with the wagon. He was 60 now, heavier through the middle than he'd been when she met him, with white in his beard and the particular economy of movement of a man who has done physical work for 40 years and knows where to spend himself and where to conserve. He helped her up to the wagon seat with the same hand, one motion, that he had used to help Grace up to the wagon on the day they left Red Creek. She had never told him she remembered that detail. She remembered it. They drove home in the November dark with the stars doing what they always did at this latitude, which was be more than you expected. The prairie was dry grass brown on both sides of the road, and the air had the good cold edge of the season, and the wagon moved at the pace of a team that knew the road and trusted it. "How did it go?" Caleb asked. "The committee will vote in January." She pulled her coat closer. "I think it passes." "It'll pass," he said. "You always think it'll pass. I've been right most of the time." She looked at him. He was watching the road with the particular attention of a man who has driven this road 10,000 times and still gives it his attention because that is how he is built. 14 years. She had known him for 14 years, which was longer than she had known Thomas, and she understood him in the particular way you understand a person after 14 years of actual daily life together, with all the ordinary difficulty that implies and all the ordinary grace. He was not an easy man. He had never become an easy man. He still closed doors inside himself sometimes, and she could tell when it was happening, and she had learned, with effort that she did not always have, to wait. He was still blunt to the point that people who didn't know him took offense, and he still forgot sometimes that the bluntness required acknowledgement of the other person's slower pace toward the same conclusion. He had never become comfortable with being thanked for things, which meant that every time someone wanted to thank him for what he'd done that day in Red Creek, which happened occasionally as the story had become part of the public record, he became visibly and slightly miserably awkward. She loved him with the specific love that comes from knowing someone, not from imagining them. It was different from what she'd felt when they were younger, in the early years, not less but different, less urgent and more certain, like the difference between trying to remember something and simply knowing it. "A young man spoke to me today," she said, after the testimony. "His name was William Holt, Margaret Holt's son." Caleb glanced at her. "He said his mother talks about us, about what we did." She looked at the road ahead. "About what you did." Caleb was quiet. "You should hear that," she said. "I know you don't like hearing it, but you should hear it." "I bought a contract," he said. "Same as any other business transaction." "Caleb, He was quiet again. The horses moved steadily. I saw a child grab her sister's hand, he said finally. That's all. I couldn't not. That's the whole of it. Evelyn looked at him. I know, she said. That's the whole of it. You couldn't not. She turned back to the road. That's exactly what I want you to understand. That's what changes things. Not the people who are strategizing about change or calculating its cost or waiting until the situation is safe enough to act. The people who see something wrong and simply cannot walk away from it. She paused. Those are the people who actually move the world. He didn't say anything to that. She hadn't expected him to. He absorbed it the way he absorbed most things she said that mattered, without visible reaction in the moment, and then she would see evidence of it later, in some small adjustment, some different quality of attention. The ranch came into view around the long curve in the road. The cottonwood windbreak first, then the barn roof, then the house with its lights in the windows. Daniel and Clara were still in the east building they'd built 3 years ago, when the permanence of the arrangement had become clear to everyone. Robert was grown and gone to Colorado. James was in Dodge, married, with a veterinary practice that Grace had helped him set up, and that they consulted on regularly through letters that Grace wrote in the same precise hand she used for her animal charts. The house lights meant someone was home. They usually meant Caleb's youngest, a boy of 7 named Thomas, which had been her suggestion, which Caleb had agreed to without making a thing of it, was still awake past his bedtime doing whatever 7-year-old boys did when no one was watching them closely enough. She would need to address that. She did not particularly dread addressing it, which she thought said something about who she had become in 14 years. Caleb brought the wagon to a stop at the barn. He climbed down and then turned and helped her down, his hands sure and familiar, and she stepped down onto the hard November ground of her own yard and looked at her house with its lights. She thought about the day she had stood on a platform in August heat and heard numbers called out for her and her daughters, and how the world had looked from there, the faces of strangers, her children's fear, the absolute quality of her helplessness. She thought about it the way she thought about it regularly now, not as wound but as reference point, as the thing she carried so she would never forget the weight. She thought about what she wanted to say to the women who were standing on platforms right now, in the counties and states where the work was not yet done, where the law had not yet changed, where they were watching the crowd and looking for someone who would not walk away. She had learned that she could not reach all of them. She had tried to reach as many as she could. She had understood over the years that the gap between those two things was where most of the real grief lived. The knowledge that your capacity has limits and the world's need does not. But she had also understood something else. Standing in the hallway of the Topeka Committee building, looking at Margaret Holt's son with his tired eyes and his notebook. You don't have to save everyone. You have to refuse to look away. You have to be willing to say, this is not my business, and then do it anyway. You have to be the person who stands at the back of the crowd and calculates the cost and pays it. Not because you will succeed completely. You will not. Not because the world will thank you efficiently or in proportion to what you gave. It will not. But because a child will grab her sister's hand and you will see it, and that moment will live in you whether you act on it or not. And the choice of what to do with what lives in you is the only real choice you get. Caleb was already in the barn. She could hear him talking to the horses in the low, even voice he used with animals. The same voice she'd listened to for 14 years, familiar as her own breathing. She walked toward the house. Halfway across the yard, the door opened and Thomas appeared, 7 years old, in his nightclothes, having clearly heard the wagon, with the specific expression of a child who knows he is where he shouldn't be and is hoping the circumstances will protect him. I was waiting up, he said. You were not supposed to be waiting up, Evelyn said. I know. He looked past her toward the barn. Is Papa back too? Yes. He came down the steps and ran across the yard toward the barn, which was not where he was supposed to be going and at this hour would not be permitted for long. But she watched him go for a moment before she turned him back, the small figure in his white nightclothes crossing the dark yard toward the light in the barn door, toward his father's voice. And she let herself look at it, at all of it. The house, the barn, the yard, the dark sky enormous above everything. The life that had been built here in the years since the day a stranger stood up in a crowd and refused to look away. The life that had been built from the ruins of the life before, which had been real and which she did not forget, but which was behind her now. She let herself look at it for as long as it deserved. Then she turned Thomas around by his shoulders and sent him back inside to bed, and she followed him up the porch steps and through the door, into the warmth and light of the house where everything that mattered to her was. And she pulled the door shut behind her against the cold,